Before we begin the horror show, tell me where you're from. Drop your city name in the comments, and if there's a creepy story tied to it, I'll make sure to feature it in a future video. Your city's frightful past could be the next to terrorize us all. College is supposed to be a time of discovery, freedom, and unforgettable memories. But for these students, the memories turned into nightmares. From dorms with dark pasts to shadowy figures that lurk in the lecture halls, these 10 disturbing, true college horror stories will make you think twice before staying on campus after dark. Lock your doors, turn off the lights, and prepare yourself for the kind of terror you can't ignore. Story number 1. The clock on the wall ticked away with an almost mocking precision. Jenna sat at her desk, surrounded by textbooks that seemed to have grown heavier by the hour. Her head pounded with a relentless rhythm, a mixture of stress and exhaustion. Finals week had arrived, and her dreams of acing her courses had crumbled under the weight of procrastination and last-minute cramming. It wasn't that Jenna was a lazy student. Far from it. She had always prided herself on her ability to balance her social life with her studies. But this semester had been different. The sudden loss of her mother to a car accident in the fall had rocked her to the core. Since then, she'd been floating through her classes like a ghost, the pages of her textbooks blurring into meaningless shapes and figures. Every attempt to study felt hollow, as if the knowledge itself was slipping away from her. She glanced over at the calendar on her wall. The final exams were tomorrow, and she still hadn't cracked open half of her notes. Panic gnawed at her insides, tightening her chest. But it wasn't just the looming exams that terrified her. It was the one thing that had been gnawing at the back of her mind all semester. The one thing she'd heard whispered about in hushed voices in the campus library. The legend. Her friend Claire had told her about it one night while they were sitting in the dorm lounge, discussing their impending exams. Claire had always been the superstitious type, the one who seemed to believe in everything from zodiac signs to campus legends. "There's a way to get rid of your failure, you know," Claire had said, as though she were revealing some great secret. "It's an old ritual, a tradition here. The students call it the final exam ritual." Jenna had raised an eyebrow, trying to mask her lack of interest. "What's that supposed to mean?" Claire leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "It's simple. If you fail your final exam, you can make a deal with an entity, a dark one. It'll erase your failure for you. But there's a price." Jenna scoffed, shaking her head. "You don't really believe that, do you?" Claire shrugged. "I don't know, but they say that if you perform the ritual, it grants you a second chance. You just have to be desperate enough to ask for it." The idea seemed absurd. A dark entity? A pact for grades? Jenna dismissed it as nonsense. Just another superstition passed down among college students. But as the days wore on and the weight of the finals pressed down on her, she couldn't shake the lingering thought. What if, just this once, it was real? What if she could erase the mistakes she had made this semester? It was 2 a.m. now, the silence of her dorm room heavy around her. Her study guide lay forgotten on her desk, half of the pages torn in frustration. Her thoughts raced as she stared at the wall, her eyes glazed over with exhaustion. How could she possibly pass tomorrow's exam? There was no way she could cram all of the material into her already overloaded brain. Her hand reached instinctively for her phone, scrolling through her social media feed with no real interest. She needed something, anything, to distract her from the pressure, the overwhelming feeling of failure creeping in. It was then that her eyes caught on a post from an anonymous account, one that she had seen on the campus rumor board before. "Final exam ritual, how to summon the entity, proceed at your own risk." The words sent a chill down her spine. Jenna clicked the link, her heart thudding louder in her chest. The page was a mix of cryptic instructions and warnings. But one phrase stood out above the rest. "Ask for a second chance, and the entity will give it. But be warned, the price isn't always what you think." The post didn't offer much detail, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. Her fingers hovered over the screen, indecision battling against the desperate need for an escape from the impending failure. Was this truly a way out? or just a dangerous myth, a story meant to scare gullible students into believing in the supernatural? But as the clock ticked on, her doubts began to dissolve, replaced by a single overwhelming emotion: desperation. She needed to pass. She couldn't afford to fail. And the more she thought about it, the more the idea of making a deal seemed like the only way out. The instructions were simple. She needed to wait until the witching hour, 3 a.m., when the entity was said to be most active. Then she would perform the ritual, write down her failure, her regrets, and her desire to be freed from them. Finally, she would speak the words aloud, asking the entity for a second chance. If the ritual worked, she would wake up the next day with a perfect score on her exam. Her life would be back on track. The question was, what price would she have to pay? But that question seemed trivial in her panic. After all, wasn't this exactly what she needed? A second chance. One last opportunity to make things right. Jenna took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she grabbed a pen and paper. She scribbled down her desperate plea, her handwriting shaky as she poured out her frustration, her fear, and her hopelessness. When she finished, she looked at the words, wondering how she had gotten to this point. I need a second chance. Please let me pass the exam. Let me fix my mistakes. I'll do anything. The clock on her desk blinked 2:59 a.m., the final minute ticking away. Jenna's heart pounded in her chest as she whispered the words aloud. I need a second chance. The room seemed to grow colder. A shadow flickered at the corner of her vision, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Still, the feeling of being watched pressed heavily against her, suffocating her. She stood there for a moment, waiting for something to happen, her breath shallow, her hands clammy, but nothing did. For a moment, Jenna felt foolish, like she had just committed herself to some pointless, superstitious ritual. She let out a bitter laugh, realizing how ridiculous it all seemed. But then, something changed. The air around her felt thicker, as though a weight had settled in the room. And that's when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone breathing right next to her ear. I can help you, but at a cost. Jenna froze, her blood running cold. She spun around, searching the room for the source of the voice, but she was alone. Completely, utterly alone. The whisper came again, louder this time. A sinister murmur that sent a chill down her spine. I will grant your wish, but you will pay the price. Before she could respond, the room seemed to darken, the shadows lengthening, swirling, closing in around her. Jenna's heart hammered in her chest, her mind racing. What had she done? What had she invited into her life? Then everything went black. Jenna awoke with a start, gasping for air as the weight of the darkness around her seemed to lift. Her heart raced, thumping in her chest as she fumbled for her phone on the nightstand. The clock read 6:30 a.m., just a few hours before the exam. She blinked several times, trying to clear the fog from her mind. What had just happened? Was it a dream? She rubbed her face, feeling the remnants of the chill that had settled over her during the ritual. The shadows, the whispering voice. It all felt so real. But now as she sat up in her bed, the room seemed unchanged. The same dorm room, the same flickering lamp on her desk. Everything looked normal, except for one thing. The paper on her desk was gone. Her stomach twisted with unease. She distinctly remembered writing her plea for a second chance, her desperate words inked on the paper. But now it was nowhere to be found. Did she forget where she placed it? Her eyes darted around the room, but the sheet was nowhere in sight. The whisper echoed in her mind again. I will grant your wish, but you will pay the price. Jenna felt a shiver run down her spine. It had to be a nightmare. She had been stressed, overworked. Her mind had played tricks on her. She tried to shake off the unease as she glanced at her study notes. The exam still loomed, and there was no time for distractions. She needed to focus. This was her only shot at saving her grades. The day passed in a blur. Jenna attended class, though her mind was elsewhere, haunted by the eerie feeling that had settled over her. She couldn't shake the image of the shadowy presence that had surrounded her in the night. Something was wrong. She could feel it, creeping at the edge of her consciousness. As the final exam approached, her classmates seemed anxious but determined, flipping through their notes one last time. Jenna felt a strange calm, an unsettling peace. The usual dread of impending tests had been replaced by something else, a quiet certainty that somehow she would succeed. By the time the exam began, Jenna's anxiety had dissipated entirely. She sat at her desk, the familiar exam papers in front of her, the questions she had struggled with earlier now feeling trivial. As her pen moved across the paper, answering questions with a fluidity she hadn't expected, Jenna's mind raced with a thought. Had the ritual worked? She couldn't explain it, but everything felt different now. The questions seemed so much easier than before. Her hand moved as if guided by something beyond her control. Was it the entity? Had she truly made a deal that would change her fate? She finished early, an odd sense of accomplishment in the air. As she handed in her paper, a strange grin tugged at her lips. She had done it. She had passed. The anxiety, the fear, all of it had melted away in the course of a single night. The ritual had worked. She felt it in her bones. But when she stepped outside the exam hall and breathed in the crisp air, she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. A student, huddled in the corner of the courtyard, was crying uncontrollably. Jenna recognized her immediately. Megan, a classmate from her history class. Megan's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. A group of students had gathered around her, trying to calm her down, but it was clear that she was in a state of shock. "Jenna," Megan whispered hoarsely when she saw her. "Jenna, it's happening. I saw the thing. It's coming for us. I don't know how to stop it." Before Jenna could respond, Megan was dragged away by her friends, muttering incoherently about a shadow, about something that had followed her back from the woods. Her heart thudded in her chest, a horrible, creeping sensation filling her. Megan's behavior was erratic, her words frantic, and it wasn't long before whispers spread through the campus about the incident. Jenna tried to push the thought from her mind. It had to be coincidence. It had to be. But that nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. That night, as Jenna lay in bed, she heard the whispers again. This time they were louder. The familiar voice, the one that had spoken to her during the ritual, crept through her room as though it were standing right next to her, its cold breath against her ear. "The deal has been struck, but the price must be paid." Jenna's heart raced. She sat up in bed, her eyes wide in terror. The room was empty. No shadowy figure stood in the corner. No chilling presence filled the air. But the whispers, they were real. Suddenly, the door to her room creaked open. Jenna froze, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She hadn't heard anyone approach. Slowly, cautiously, she swung her legs off the bed and stood up, moving toward the door. As she reached for the doorknob, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You've awakened it. The cost is coming for you." She yanked open the door and stepped into the hallway, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The corridor was dark, silent, and empty. Yet as she turned the corner, she noticed something, a fresh trail of blood leading from the dorm's stairwell toward the entrance. It was unmistakable. The dark red streak was smeared along the floor like a message. Her stomach lurched. She followed the trail, her footsteps silent on the old wooden floors, until she reached the door leading to the campus woods. The door was slightly ajar, the night air flowing in, carrying with it a sense of dread. The whispers grew louder. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure. It was there, and then gone, like a fleeting shadow slipping between the trees. And then she heard it, a sharp, inhuman scream that pierced the night. Jenna turned and ran back to her dorm, the door slamming shut behind her. She collapsed onto her bed, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had she truly summoned something? That night, Jenna didn't sleep. The sounds of footsteps in the hall grew louder and more frequent, as though the entity was moving through the dormitory, searching for something or someone. And just as she began to drift off, exhausted from the terror, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching her door. The price had come due. Jenna's eyes snapped open. The darkness of her room pressed in on her like a suffocating weight. Her heart pounded in her chest as her breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. The footsteps had stopped at her door. For several minutes, there was only silence, thick and oppressive, like the calm before a storm. But the silence was shattered by a voice, low, guttural, and unmistakably sinister. Your soul is forfeit. The price must be paid. Jenna bolted upright in her bed, her body trembling with fear. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was coming from the room itself, echoing from every corner. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying that it was a nightmare, that none of this was real. But when she opened her eyes, the room had changed. The shadows were deeper, thicker. The air felt colder, as though a frost had descended without warning. And that smell, the stench of something foul and decaying, was stronger now, filling her nostrils and making her gag. She stumbled out of bed, her legs unsteady, and moved toward the door. As she touched the knob, it felt wrong. The metal was ice cold, as though it had been touched by death itself. With shaking hands, she twisted it open and stepped into the hallway. At first, the hallway seemed empty. The lights flickered above her, casting eerie, half-lit shadows on the walls. But as she walked, the shadows seemed to shift and move of their own accord. There was something following her, something watching her. Her eyes darted to the end of the hall, where the campus woods loomed just beyond the building. The door was ajar, the same trail of blood leading toward it. But this time, the trail was darker, thicker, more vivid. Jenna felt a chill seep into her bones as she followed the trail, drawn forward by a force she couldn't understand. The further she went, the more the whispers grew. They weren't just voices anymore. They were commands. The words had power now. Come closer. It's waiting for you. She shook her head, desperately trying to block out the words. She couldn't let herself be taken by whatever this was. She had to stop it. She had to undo the ritual, reverse whatever had been set in motion. But it was too late. She reached the door to the woods, and as her hand touched the cold metal handle, a figure appeared at the threshold. A tall, gaunt figure, shrouded in darkness. Its eyes were glowing, yellow and unblinking, piercing through the dark as though they could see into her very soul. It stood motionless, watching her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Jenna froze, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't human. There was something wrong with it, something unnatural. She had never seen anything like it before, but the way it moved, the way it waited, made her heart stutter with pure terror. You summoned me. The voice was deep, resonant, and filled with an ancient malice. Now you must pay the price. Jenna opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The entity stepped forward, its long, skeletal fingers stretching toward her. The air seemed to grow colder with every step it took, the darkness around her deepening. Without warning, she turned and ran. She dashed down the hallway, her feet pounding against the floor, her heart a frantic drumbeat in her chest. But no matter how fast she ran, she couldn't escape the feeling that it was right behind her, that it was closing in, always just a few steps away. She skidded around a corner, nearly crashing into the walls and slammed into the nearest door. She forced it open, stumbling inside a classroom, hoping to hide, to escape from whatever horror was chasing her. But the room was already occupied. Megan sat at one of the desks, her hands clutching her head. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear. She looked up at Jenna as if she had been expecting her. You shouldn't have done it, Megan whispered, her voice shaking with terror. It's here. It's coming for us. We're all going to die. Jenna's eyes darted around the room. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows growing thicker. The whispers were louder now, like a chorus of voices, all demanding the same thing. The price must be paid. Your soul is mine. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside. The room went pitch black, the air thick with an oppressive weight. And then, through the darkness, Jenna saw it. The glowing eyes of the entity, staring at her from the far corner of the room. It had found her. The room pulsed with a sinister energy, the very air thick with the presence of the entity. Jenna's heart raced, her breath shallow and erratic, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Megan's voice had become a faint whisper, lost in the overwhelming noise of the whispers that filled the room. They came from every corner, every shadow and every crack in the walls. The words echoed in her head, their meaning clear and undeniable. The price must be paid. Your soul is mine. Jenna looked desperately at Megan, whose face was pale and stricken, with a terror that mirrored her own. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The air around her felt suffocating, as if the entity itself were choking the life from her lungs. The figure in the corner of the room moved, its long, gnarled fingers stretching toward her with unnatural speed. Its eyes, glowing yellow, empty, and cold, bore into Jenna's soul. She wanted to run, to flee, but her body refused to obey. The fear was paralyzing. Every instinct screamed for her to escape, but she felt rooted to the spot, unable to move. And then, the entity spoke again. You summoned me. Now you will pay. Jenna tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't let this happen. She couldn't let everyone she loved die because of a stupid mistake she had made in a moment of desperation. But the entity's power was overwhelming. The darkness crept toward her like a physical force, wrapping around her like cold, clammy fingers. Her vision blurred, and her legs buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the floor, unable to fight it any longer. In that moment of despair, a voice cut through the darkness. It wasn't Megan's. It wasn't even the entity's. You don't have to do this. Jenna's head snapped up. There in the doorway stood a figure she hadn't expected to see. It was Professor Adler, the one who had warned her about the ritual. His face was grave, but there was a determination in his eyes. I told you, he said quietly, stepping into the room. There's always a choice. Jenna could hardly believe her eyes. Professor, you knew about this? Adler nodded solemnly. I've seen it before. It always comes down to a choice. The entity, the price, it can be undone, but only if you're willing to make the ultimate sacrifice. The shadows in the room seemed to grow more restless at his words, the whispers turning into screams. The figure in the corner, now fully materialized, moved toward them with a slow, deliberate pace. The entity's eyes were locked on Jenna, and its voice slithered into her mind. No one escapes me. The professor's voice was firm as he stepped between Jenna and the entity. You can't escape. You don't have to offer your soul. There's another way. Jenna, weak and trembling, barely found her voice. What way? How? Professor Adler didn't hesitate. You must offer someone else's soul, someone who's already made a deal. It will break the bond, sever the contract. It's the only way. Jenna's heart clenched in horror. The thought of sacrificing someone else was repulsive. She couldn't do it. She couldn't. But the entity was closing in now. The room seemed to tremble under its presence. The floor beneath her feet cracked, splintering in long, jagged lines. Jenna's body screamed at her to act, to make the choice. The professor's face was a mask of resolve, but his eyes, those eyes, betrayed a deep, hidden fear. Do it, he whispered, before it's too late. The room went silent, the whispers fading into nothingness. For a brief, terrible moment, everything hung suspended, as though the entire universe was waiting for Jenna to make her decision. She looked at the professor, then at the entity. She felt the weight of the choice pressed down on her chest like a stone. Then with a cry, she pushed herself to her feet. The air thickened around her, and she felt herself being drawn into the darkness. Her body shook as she stepped toward the professor, but before she could say a word, the entity spoke one final time. You cannot escape me, child. Jenna gritted her teeth. She was already too far gone to turn back. The ritual was almost complete, and the price was inevitable. Take his soul, she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it rang out loud in her ears. Take his. There was a moment of eerie stillness. The professor's eyes widened in shock, but it was too late for him to protest. The entity surged forward, its glowing eyes widening, and in an instant, it was upon him. The room erupted in blinding light as the entity's power reached its peak. Jenna squeezed her eyes shut, unable to watch. She could feel the air around her crackling, thick with the entity's wrath, and then, in the blink of an eye, it was over. The light dissipated, leaving Jenna alone in the classroom. The professor, who had been standing only moments before, was gone. Only the shadows remained, whispering softly, as though the entity had already moved on to its next victim. Jenna collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The weight of what she had done sank in, and the horror of it crashed over her in waves. She had made a choice, an irreversible one, and now there was no going back. The door to the room opened slowly, revealing the soft glow of the hallway light. Outside, the campus was silent, untouched by the horrors that had just unfolded. Jenna stood, her legs weak beneath her, her mind reeling. The professor's fate was sealed, and so was hers. She had given in, and she could feel the entity's presence lingering, waiting for its next command. The price had been paid, and the final exam was far from over. Story number 2. The dim light of early morning crept through the blinds, casting a soft golden glow over the cramped dorm room. Emily groggily opened her eyes, blinking at the unfamiliar stillness. The sounds of campus life, a distant lawnmower, the occasional student rushing to class, the hum of a passing car, seemed unusually muted today. She turned her head, expecting to see her roommate Claire still tangled in her blankets, snoring softly as usual. But the bed beside hers was empty. The covers were smooth, too smooth. Claire's bed looked untouched, the pillow plumped up neatly, as though it had never been used. "Claire," Emily murmured, her voice groggy from sleep. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. She rubbed her eyes, her heart skipping a beat. Maybe Claire had gone for a morning run, or maybe she was out for breakfast. She'd been known to wake up early sometimes to get ahead on her schoolwork, but Emily had never woken up before Claire. Her gaze drifted to the side of the room where Claire's desk sat, cluttered with textbooks and papers. It seemed untouched as well. No laptop, no coffee mug. The usual chaos of her things, scattered papers, open books, was missing. Frowning, Emily rolled out of bed, her feet landing on the cold wooden floor. She stretched, trying to shake off the sense of unease building in her chest. Something didn't feel right. Claire always had her things everywhere, always left something behind, like her headphones or half-finished cereal bowls. But this morning, it was as if Claire had disappeared without a trace. "Claire!" Emily called again, louder this time. No response. She padded over to the door and peeked into the hallway, hoping to catch a glimpse of her roommate. The dorm was eerily quiet, a few students trickling past in their pajamas on their way to the showers or the cafeteria, but none of them paid any attention to Emily. She frowned. Where was Claire? Her stomach tightened. She stepped back into the room, glancing over at the small cluttered corner where Claire's shoes and bag usually sat. They were gone too. Only the empty remnants of Claire's things remained, leaving a strange, gnawing emptiness behind. Emily couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. She walked over to Claire's bed, kneeling down to look under it. There, partially hidden in the shadow of the bed frame, was something. A single shoe turned over, damp and dirty. "What the hell?" Emily whispered under her breath, bending down to pick it up. She turned it over in her hand. The dampness was blood, a smear of it across the bottom of the shoe, caked into the heel. Her pulse quickened. Claire had never come home last night. She had only gone out with some friends after their last class. So where had she gone? Why hadn't she said anything? "Claire?" Emily called again, her voice trembling. She was starting to panic now, her mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe Claire had gone to visit a friend off campus, but why hadn't she left a note or sent a text? Why was the shoe bloody? Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed on the nightstand. Her heart skipped as she grabbed it, hoping it was a message from Claire explaining everything. Instead, it was from Nate, the boyfriend. "Hey, is Claire with you?" "She's not answering her phone." Emily's stomach dropped. She quickly typed back, "No, she wasn't here when I woke up. I thought she might be with you." Seconds ticked by before Nate replied, his message coming faster than expected. "She didn't come home last night. I'm heading over now." Her hands shook as she read the words again. This couldn't be happening. It was too early for this kind of thing. She sat down on the edge of her bed, staring at the phone in disbelief. What could have happened? Minutes later, Emily heard the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway. Nate burst through the door, his face drawn and pale. His eyes darted frantically around the room before landing on Emily. "She's gone," he said, his voice tight. "I don't understand. Where is she? Have you heard from her at all?" Emily shook her head. "I don't know where she is. I woke up and her bed was empty, and there was no note. Nothing. I found this shoe, though." She handed him the bloody shoe. Nate stared at it, his face paling even further. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, dropping it on the bed. "Do you think something happened to her?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know, but we need to find her," Nate said, his voice strained. "She wouldn't just disappear like this. I can't reach her on her phone. We need to call campus security or the police." Emily nodded, but something gnawed at her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Claire hadn't simply gone missing. Something wasn't right. Something was wrong. She glanced at the door, the hairs on the back of her neck prickling. The walls of their tiny dorm room suddenly felt suffocating, and a strange sensation of being watched crept up her spine. "Wait," Emily said, her voice trembling. "There's something else. I found a diary. Claire's diary. It's..." Nate grabbed her arm, cutting her off. "A diary? What did it say?" Emily pulled the small leather-bound book from the shelf, handing it over. Nate skimmed through the pages, his eyes scanning the unsettling entries. The more he read, the paler he became. Finally, he closed the book with a snap. "She saw something in the woods behind the dorms," he said, his voice low and tense. It's not just a coincidence." Emily felt a chill wash over her. "What do you mean?" Nate's gaze turned grim. "Claire wasn't just missing. I think something took her, and I think it's still out there, waiting." The entire day passed in a blur. The hours crawled by, each one weighed down by the growing anxiety gnawing at Emily's chest. Her mind was racing, and every time she closed her eyes, she could hear the unsettling whisper of the wind outside, reminding her of the eerie feeling she had when she first woke up to find Claire gone. The unease settled deep into her bones, a cold weight she couldn't shake. Nate and Emily had spent hours walking around campus, searching for any clue about Claire's whereabouts. They talked to friends, her professors, and even checked the student lounge and cafeteria. But there was no trace of Claire. No one had seen her since the night before. By late afternoon, they had decided to visit the campus security office. Emily clutched Claire's diary tightly in her hand, trying to focus on the facts, but it was hard to ignore the sick feeling that kept growing in her stomach. The security office was small, tucked in the corner of one of the older buildings on campus. It smelled faintly of coffee and stale paper. The officer behind the desk, a middle-aged man with a disinterested look on his face, glanced up as they approached. "What can I help you with?" he asked flatly, not even bothering to stand. "We're looking for our friend. She's missing," Emily said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to remain calm. "Her name is Claire Roberts. She's a freshman here, and no one's seen her since last night." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Missing, huh? You sure she's not just off somewhere with friends?" Emily's frustration flared. "No, we've checked everywhere. Her room, the dorms, even her phone's gone straight to voicemail. She wouldn't just disappear like that." The officer sighed and tapped at his keyboard, probably pulling up the report on Claire. "Well, the thing is, there's no official missing persons report yet. If she's just gone for a day, it's not a big deal. Give it some time." "But," Nate started, his voice tight with anger. "We can't just wait," Emily interrupted, her voice rising. "There's something wrong. Claire's diary, she's been writing about strange things happening, about the woods behind the dorms. She was scared of something." The officer's demeanor changed slightly, but not enough to ease Emily's rising panic. He leaned back in his chair, studying them for a moment before sighing. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone almost dismissive. "But if you think something's really wrong, you should go to the police. This is just a campus security office. You're going to have to file a report downtown if you want it to go anywhere." Emily and Nate exchanged a glance. Emily felt a chill creep up her spine, the officer's indifference adding to the growing sense of dread. Thanks, Nate muttered, clearly frustrated. They turned and walked out of the office, but Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off about the whole exchange. The officer's tone had been too casual, as if he'd seen this happen before and didn't care anymore. The air outside was crisp, the sky slowly fading to an unsettling shade of gray. The campus felt quieter than usual, as if the very ground was holding its breath. Emily walked in silence, trying to collect her thoughts, but the more she thought about Claire's disappearance, the more she felt like they were missing something vital. Nate, Emily said suddenly, her voice low and shaky, I have to know more. I need to go to the woods. I need to see where Claire went. Nate stopped walking and turned to face her, his brow furrowing. The woods? What do you mean? That's a bad idea, Em. Emily paused, her voice faltering as the words tumbled out. I keep thinking about what she wrote in her diary. She said something about being drawn to the woods. She mentioned something watching her, something not human. Nate looked hesitant, but Emily could see the same uncertainty in his eyes. He wanted to help Claire too, but he was scared, just like her. But Emily couldn't stand the thought of sitting around waiting for someone else to do something. We have to go, she insisted. We have to find out what's out there. After a long pause, Nate finally nodded, albeit reluctantly. Fine, but we need to be careful. If there's something in those woods, we're not going in unprepared. Emily could feel her heart pounding in her chest. They didn't have any plan, no idea of what they would find, but she was determined. If there was any chance of finding Claire, this was the only lead they had left. But it was just after dusk when they arrived at the edge of the woods behind the dorms. The shadows stretched long across the ground, the trees creaking as the wind whispered through the branches. Emily felt a strange sense of foreboding as she stepped into the darkening forest. The sounds of campus life seemed to fade into the background, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. It was as though the woods themselves were holding secrets, secrets that Claire had once come too close to. Nate was beside her, his face tense and alert. This is crazy, Em, he muttered, looking around nervously. What if we're just making things worse? What if she's not out here at all? I have to know, Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. If there's something in these woods, I need to know what it is. They moved deeper into the forest, their steps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. The further they went, the more the world around them seemed to close in, the trees crowding in on them like silent sentinels. After what felt like hours of walking, they reached a clearing. It was here, Claire had written, that she had first noticed something was wrong. Emily stepped into the center of the clearing, scanning the area with wide eyes. The ground was covered in footprints, and though the wind was gentle, the air had a heavy, oppressive feel to it. Suddenly, Emily froze, her eyes catching a movement in the distance. Something was out there. Something was watching them. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stared into the shadows of the woods. Her breath caught in her throat as her eyes tried to pierce the gloom, searching for the source of the movement she had seen. The rustling of the leaves had stopped, and all that remained was the eerie silence, thick and suffocating. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but she couldn't move. She had to know what was out there. Nate, she whispered, her voice trembling. Nate, who had been standing behind her, stepped forward. His gaze followed hers, scanning the dark forest. What did you see? He asked, his voice tight with fear. His eyes darted nervously between the trees, but he couldn't see anything. I don't know, Emily replied, shaking her head, still frozen in place. Something moved. It wasn't an animal. It was too fast, too deliberate. Nate's hand found hers in the dark, squeezing it tightly. His touch was cold, his fingers trembling. Let's get out of here. This is a bad idea, Emily. We should call the cops, or the security guard, or someone. But Emily couldn't move. She couldn't leave. Not without understanding what had happened to Claire. Not without discovering the truth of what lurked in these woods. Claire was here, she said softly, more to herself than to Nate. She must have been. Nate's grip on her hand tightened, pulling her gently back. We don't know that for sure. What if she's... His voice faltered, and Emily could feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts. What if Claire was already gone? What if something had already happened to her, and there was no hope left? She couldn't let herself think like that. She had to believe Claire was still alive, that she could be saved. "Let's just take a few more steps," Emily said, pulling away from Nate and stepping further into the clearing. "We're so close to the edge of the woods, we have to see this through." Reluctantly, Nate followed her. The clearing was unnaturally still, the air heavy with an odd, almost palpable tension. As they moved deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing up the light of the fading day. Emily could feel something watching them, a presence that wasn't quite human, a presence that was older, more ancient, and more dangerous than anything she had ever known. They had only gone a few steps when they heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, a scraping, a faint scratch against wood or stone. The noise came from the trees ahead of them, so quiet it could have been the wind, except that it sounded too deliberate, too alive. Emily stopped in her tracks and Nate froze beside her. Neither of them said a word, but their bodies tensed and every muscle in their legs screamed at them to run. "Do you hear that?" Emily whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. Nate nodded, his face pale in the dark. "Yeah, what is that?" Before either of them could answer, a figure appeared in the shadows ahead. It was a tall, indistinct shape, standing completely still in the dark. Its outline was obscured by the thick trees, but there was no mistaking the sense of something wrong, something impossibly wrong. "Claire?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. But the figure didn't move. Instead, the air seemed to grow even colder, the darkness thickening around them like a living entity. The faint scraping noise continued, slowly growing louder, coming closer with every passing second. And then, without warning, the figure began to move. The first thing Emily noticed was the sound of its footsteps. Not the crunch of snow or the rustle of leaves underfoot, but something else, something wet. The sound of skin dragging against the earth, the sound of something unnatural moving through the forest. The figure took a slow step forward, then another until it was only a few feet away. Emily's breath hitched in her chest, her throat dry and tight. And then it spoke. The voice was Claire's. "Emily! Nate!" The voice echoed out of the darkness, but it was wrong. It was a distorted version of Claire's voice, stretched and warped in a way that made Emily's skin crawl. It was like hearing a voice from a nightmare, familiar yet impossibly alien. "Don't come closer," Emily whispered, stepping back, her heart racing. "Claire, is that you?" The figure in the darkness stopped. Emily's blood ran cold when she realized it wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting, watching. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward again, and Emily stumbled back in fear, bumping into Nate. He grabbed her arm, pulling her away as the figure advanced. "We need to leave. Now," Nate urged, his voice panicked. "This is not Claire. We have to get out of here." But Emily couldn't tear her eyes away from the figure, her body frozen in terror. The creature, it couldn't be human. It couldn't be Claire. It was something else entirely. Something from the depths of the woods. Something ancient. A branch snapped behind them, and Emily spun around, her eyes wide with terror. From the shadows emerged another figure, then another and another. More of them, dozens of them, closing in from all sides. Emily's mind was racing. They were surrounded. "They're coming for us," Emily said, her voice breaking. Nate's hand gripped hers, his eyes wide with horror. "We have to run, right now." Without another word, they turned and bolted through the trees, their hearts pounding in their chests, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The figures behind them moved with inhuman speed, their footsteps barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. Emily could hear them now, hear the strange, rasping breath of the creatures, the low growl that reverberated through the air. Whatever these things were, they were closing in on them, and they wouldn't stop until they caught them. Emily's mind raced, but one thought kept repeating over and over in her mind. Claire was right. Something was in these woods, and it was hungry. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she and Nate sprinted through the woods, the shadows of the twisted trees closing in around them. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of the leaves felt like the creatures were right behind them, gaining ground. Emily could hear the low growls echoing through the trees, the breath of something hungry, relentless. "Nate, I can't," Emily gasped, her legs burning from the effort. Her mind was fogged with panic, her thoughts tumbling into chaos. "Where are we going? We'll never outrun them." Nate's grip tightened on her arm. "We don't have a choice, Emily. We have to find somewhere safe. We have to hide." They pushed forward, stumbling through the underbrush, desperate to escape the unnatural pursuit. Emily could feel the forest around them closing in, the trees looming like sentinels, blocking out the last remnants of light. And then it happened. They broke through the trees into a small clearing, and there, standing in the center, was a figure. At first, Emily thought it was Claire, standing there in the moonlight, looking as though she had been waiting for them. Her hair hung in messy tangles around her face, her eyes wide and empty, staring straight ahead, as though she was lost in some trance. But as Emily took a step closer, she saw the truth. The figure wasn't Claire. It was something worse. The thing before them was pale, almost gaunt, its skin stretched too tight over its bones, its mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Its eyes were wide and hollow, black pits where light should have been. And its body, oh God, its body was covered in deep, jagged cuts, raw and bleeding, as though it had been torn apart and put back together again. Nate froze beside Emily, his face drained of color. What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. It's not Claire," Emily managed, but the words didn't comfort her. The thing was mimicking Claire's appearance, but it was twisted, wrong, beyond recognition. The creature took a step forward, its feet dragging through the dirt, its face remaining expressionless, vacant. And then, in a voice that was not Claire's but somehow still familiar, it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was a guttural rasp, each word laced with malice. It wasn't human anymore. It was something else, something ancient, something that had existed long before the college had even been built. "What the hell are you?" Emily cried, her voice shaking with terror. The creature didn't answer. Instead, it extended a long skeletal hand toward her, its fingers twitching with hunger. Behind them, the sounds of footsteps came closer, too many to count. Emily turned, heart hammering in her chest, and saw them. Dozens of them emerging from the shadows of the trees. Their eyes glowed in the dark, their bodies twisted and broken, all moving with a slow, deliberate crawl. It was then that Emily realized with chilling clarity, the creatures were coming for them. They weren't after Claire anymore. They were after them, and there was nowhere to run. The creature in front of her raised its hand, beckoning her closer, its mouth opening in a sickening grin, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Join us," it hissed. Nate shoved Emily backward, his face pale and desperate. "Run, Emily, run!" But Emily didn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, her body refusing to obey her mind. The creatures had them cornered. There was no escape. And then out of nowhere, a sound, something like a crack of thunder, echoed through the forest, sending a shockwave of cold through the air. The creatures paused, their heads snapping toward the sound. Emily could feel the air shift, like a storm was about to break. "Emily!" Nate screamed, pulling her with all his strength, his voice panicked. "We need to get out of here, now!" The air around them seemed to vibrate with energy, the darkness closing in tighter, suffocating them. They turned and ran again, their feet barely finding purchase on the uneven ground, their breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the creatures were relentless, their footsteps growing louder, closer, and then silence. For a brief moment, the world stood still. The creatures stopped. The growls faded into the distance. Emily and Nate froze, standing in the middle of the clearing, sweat dripping down their faces, their chests heaving. "What the hell was that?" Nate whispered, his voice hoarse with terror. Emily didn't answer. She was too focused on the emptiness around them. The creatures had disappeared, but she could still feel their presence, still hear their haunting whispers in the wind. They were waiting, watching. They weren't done with them yet. In the distance through the trees, Emily saw something something moving. It was a figure shrouded in the mist, moving toward them with slow, deliberate steps. Emily's heart stopped. It was Claire, or at least it looked like Claire. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant, her body covered in the same bloody, gory marks as the creature they had seen earlier. But she was alive, and she was walking toward them, her footsteps dragging in the dirt. "Claire!" Emily called out, her voice barely a whisper. Claire stopped just in front of them. Her eyes locked onto Emily's, and for a moment, Emily thought she saw recognition. But then, just as quickly, that expression faded, replaced by something empty, something terrifying. Claire's lips curled into a grotesque smile. "Emily, Nate." Claire's voice came out in a low, hollow rasp. "You were never meant to leave." And with that, the darkness closed in. The last thing Emily saw before the world went black was the figure of Claire lunging at her, the monstrous creatures swarming toward them, their eyes glowing in the dark, their mouths open, ready to feed. Story number 3. Emily Daniels stared out of the passenger side window as her father's old pickup truck rumbled up the long, winding driveway. The sprawling campus of Black Ridge University stretched out before her like a postcard, rolling green hills, towering stone buildings, and students milling about in the brisk autumn air. It was everything she had dreamed of when she applied. But as they approached Carlton Hall, something shifted. The dormitory stood apart from the other buildings, as though it had been deliberately exiled to the edge of campus. Its dark brick exterior was cloaked in ivy, and the small, dirty windows seemed more like the hollowed-out eyes of a skull than a welcoming place to live. Her father killed the engine and gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not the Taj Mahal, but you'll make it your own, kiddo." Emily forced a laugh, though a knot had begun to tighten in her stomach. "Yeah, sure. It's just older than I expected." "Older means character," her dad replied, hoisting her suitcase out of the truck bed. "Come on, let's check it out." The lobby was dimly lit, with low ceilings and the faint smell of mildew clinging to the air. A lone ceiling fan rotated lazily overhead, its blades making an unsettling creaking noise with each turn. A receptionist sat behind a scratched wooden desk, barely looking up as Emily and her father approached. "Room 314, the woman said curtly, sliding a key across the counter without so much as a smile. "Friendly place," Emily muttered under her breath as she and her father trudged down the hallway. The corridor leading to her room was eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you hyper-aware of every sound you make. The scuffed linoleum floors squeaked under their shoes, and the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead. When they finally reached room 314, her father unlocked the door and pushed it open. Emily stepped inside, and the first thing that struck her was the cold. It was as though the room hadn't seen warmth or sunlight in decades. "Cozy," her father joked, setting her suitcase down by the bed. The room was sparse, a twin bed with a sagging mattress, a desk with peeling paint, and a narrow closet that gaped open like a black hole. The single window looked out onto a courtyard that was mostly overgrown weeds and patches of dead grass. Emily crossed her arms, trying to ward off the chill that seemed to seep into her bones. "It's fine," she said, mostly to convince herself. Her father gave her a pat on the back. "That's the spirit. You're going to do great here, Em. Just give it some time." After helping her unpack, he gave her a quick hug and promised to call the next day. Emily walked him to the lobby, watching as he disappeared down the driveway in his truck. When she returned to her room, the quiet of Carlton Hall seemed even more oppressive. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, and wondered what she had gotten herself into. Emily was jolted awake by a sound she couldn't immediately identify. For a moment, she lay there in the dark, her heart pounding as her eyes darted around the room. Everything was as it had been when she'd fallen asleep. Her suitcase still sat by the desk. The closet door was ajar, and the faint glow of the courtyard security light filtered through the window. But then she heard it again, a faint creak like the groan of old wood under pressure. She sat up, clutching the blanket tightly around her. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. There was no response. Emily swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet touching the cold floor. She tiptoed to the door and pressed her ear against it, listening. The hallway beyond was silent. Shaking her head, she muttered, "Get a grip, Emily. It's just an old building." She climbed back into bed and pulled the blanket up to her chin. But as she lay there, straining to hear any more sounds, something else caught her attention, a faint whisper. At first, she thought it was the wind, but the whisper was rhythmic, almost like words spoken too softly to understand. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, curling around her ears like smoke. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. The whisper stopped. Emily's heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the room. Everything was still, but the silence now felt heavy, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. She squeezed her eyes shut and told herself it was just her imagination. The next morning, the strange events of the night before seemed distant, almost dreamlike. Emily brushed it off as first-night jitters and focused on settling in. She spent most of the day exploring the campus and meeting a few classmates, but every time someone asked where she was living, they hesitated when she said Carlton Hall. "Wow, they still use that place?" one girl said, her expression a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Yeah, why wouldn't they?" Emily replied. The girl shrugged. "No reason. It's just old, you know? Kind of creepy." Emily laughed it off, but the knot in her stomach returned. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers came again. This time they were louder, more insistent. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost angry. The closet door, which she had left half open, creaked slightly. Emily stared at it, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers stopped abruptly, and for a moment, the silence was deafening. Then with a soft click, the closet door swung open just enough to reveal the inky blackness inside. Emily froze, her mind racing. She wanted to get up and close the door, but her body refused to move. It felt as though the shadows were watching her, waiting for her to make the first move. After what felt like an eternity, she forced herself to turn on the lamp by her bed. The warm light flooded the room, chasing away the shadows. The closet door was open, but nothing was inside except for her clothes. She got up, her legs trembling, and slammed the door shut. Then she pushed her desk chair in front of it for good measure. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself as she climbed back into bed. But as she turned off the light and pulled the blanket over her head, she couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still watching her. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with a fine mist hanging low over the campus. Emily hadn't slept much. The events of the previous night played over and over in her mind, each detail magnified in the stillness of the early hours. She tried to convince herself that it was all in her head, that the creaking floorboards and whispers were nothing more than the groans of an old building, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. As she walked to her first class, she caught snippets of conversations around her. Students talked about parties, professors, and weekend plans. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were all pretending, that beneath the surface of the campus's normalcy, there was a tension no one dared to speak of. Her first lecture was a blur. The professor's voice droned on about introductory psychology, but Emily's mind kept drifting back to the closet door, the whispers and the cold that seemed to seep into her bones. After class, she decided to head to the library. If there was something strange about Carlton Hall, surely there would be records, old newspapers, university archives, something to explain the dormitory's unsettling atmosphere. The library was massive, with towering bookshelves and narrow aisles that seemed to stretch on forever. Emily approached the front desk, where a middle-aged librarian with sharp glasses and a skeptical expression was typing on an ancient-looking computer. "Hi," Emily began hesitantly. "I was wondering if you have any records about Carlton Hall. Like, maybe its history or old blueprints?" The librarian raised an eyebrow. "Carlton Hall? What's your interest in that place?" "I live there," Emily replied. "And I don't know. I just want to know more about it." The librarian's gaze lingered on her for a moment before she sighed and pushed her glasses up her nose. "Third floor, archives section. Look for the file marked Campus History, but don't spend too much time digging. Some things are better left buried. Emily nodded, her curiosity now fully piqued. The archives section was quiet and dimly lit, with rows of filing cabinets that smelled faintly of dust and mildew. After some searching, she found the file the librarian had mentioned. It was an old manila folder, its edges frayed with age. Sitting at a nearby table, Emily began flipping through its contents. At first, it was mostly mundane. Photographs of the dormitory's construction in the 1950s, lists of past residents and reports on routine maintenance. But then tucked near the back of the folder, she found a newspaper clipping that made her blood run cold. Mental asylum repurposed for student housing. Blackridge University acquires Carlton Hall property. The article detailed how Carlton Hall had originally been a mental health institution known as Blackridge Asylum, notorious for its controversial treatments and high patient mortality rate. The asylum had been shut down in the 1940s after several scandals, including reports of patient abuse and illegal experiments. Emily's hands trembled as she read further. The article mentioned that many patients had died in the building, their bodies buried in unmarked graves on the property. A faint whisper brushed against her ear, making her jump. She spun around, but the archives room was empty. That night, back in her dorm, Emily shared what she'd learned with her roommate, Sarah. Sarah was a petite, energetic girl with a passion for true crime podcasts, and she listened intently as Emily recounted the article. "So, you're telling me this place used to be an insane asylum?" Sarah said, her voice tinged with excitement and fear. Emily nodded. "And I think some of the spirits are still here. Last night, I heard whispers. The closet door opened by itself." Sarah's enthusiasm faded, replaced by concern. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Emily replied. Sarah glanced around the room, her eyes lingering on the closet. "Okay, that's freaky. But maybe it's just like old pipes or something? You know how these old buildings are." "I thought that too," Emily said. "But what if it's not? What if the spirits of those patients are still here, angry at what happened to them?" Sarah didn't have an answer for that. Later that night, as the two girls lay in their beds, the room fell into an uneasy silence. Emily stared at the ceiling, listening for any sound that might signal the presence of the spirits. Just as she was beginning to drift off, she heard it, the whispering. It was louder this time, more insistent. The voices seemed to come from every corner of the room, filling the space with a cacophony of unintelligible words. Emily sat up, her heart racing. "Sarah, do you hear that?" Sarah didn't respond. "Sarah?" Emily whispered, glancing toward her roommate's bed. Her stomach dropped. Sarah was sitting upright, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were wide open, glowing faintly in the darkness. "Emily," Sarah said, her voice layered with a deep, guttural tone that didn't belong to her. "It's watching us," Emily screamed, scrambling out of bed and backing into the corner. Sarah's head jerked toward her, the glow in her eyes growing brighter. "Leave," the voice growled, echoing unnaturally. "Leave before it's too late." And then, as suddenly as it had started, the glow vanished. Sarah blinked, her face crumpling in confusion. What just happened?" "You don't remember," Emily stammered. "Remember what?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. Emily stared at her roommate, unsure of how to explain. You weren't yourself." A loud knock at the door made both girls jump. Emily hesitated, then crept toward the door and peered through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The knock at the door left both Emily and Sarah shaken. Sarah, now visibly unnerved by Emily's account of her possession-like behavior, clung to the edge of her bed as Emily pressed her ear to the door. There was no sound beyond it, no footsteps retreating into the distance, just the oppressive silence of Carlton Hall's empty hallway. "Do we open it?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Emily shook her head. Number whoever, or whatever, knocked. I don't think they were friendly. The two girls sat in silence for a long moment, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then Sarah spoke up. "We should get out of here, Em. I don't care if I have to sleep in the common room or crash on someone's couch. This place isn't normal." Emily nodded. "Let's grab some things and go. We can figure out where to stay later." As they hastily packed their essentials into backpacks, a faint scraping noise began to echo through the walls. At first it was subtle, almost like the sound of tree branches scratching against the building. But as it grew louder, it became clear that it was coming from inside the dormitory. Sarah froze, clutching her toothbrush like a weapon. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," Emily whispered, zipping up her bag. "But we're not waiting to find out." They crept toward the door, their movements slow and deliberate. Emily reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling. The scraping sound seemed to follow them, moving through the walls as if whatever was making it knew exactly where they were. When Emily opened the door, the hallway was bathed in dim, flickering light from the overhead fixtures. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe like living things, and the air was thick with the scent of mildew. "Stick close," Emily whispered, stepping out into the corridor. The two girls moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. As they passed each door, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional flicker of the lights and the ever-present scraping sound. They were halfway to the stairwell when Sarah grabbed Emily's arm. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the end of the hallway. Emily squinted, her breath catching in her throat. A figure stood in the shadows, just out of reach of the flickering light. It was tall and hunched, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. "Who's there?" Emily called out, her voice wavering. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a single step forward, the sound of its footfall echoing ominously. "Run!" Sarah hissed, pulling Emily toward the stairs. They sprinted down the corridor, the shadowy figure's footsteps quickening behind them. Emily glanced over her shoulder and saw it moving with an unnatural speed, its limbs jerking and twitching as it closed the distance. They burst into the stairwell, slamming the heavy door shut behind them. Sarah leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. "What the hell was that?" Sarah demanded, her voice rising in panic. "I don't know," Emily replied, her chest heaving, "but we need to get out of this building now." They descended the stairs two at a time, their footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. When they reached the ground floor, they found the lobby eerily deserted. The front desk, usually staffed by a night attendant, was empty, and the glass doors leading outside were locked. "What the hell?" Sarah said, tugging at the door handle. "They shouldn't lock these doors. It's a fire hazard." Emily searched the desk for keys but found nothing. The scraping sound was back, louder now, and coming from the stairwell. "It's coming," Emily said, her voice tight with fear. Sarah's eyes darted around the lobby. "There's got to be another way out. What about the basement? Maybe there's a maintenance exit or something." Emily hesitated. The idea of going deeper into the building didn't sit well with her, but the alternative was staying in the lobby, waiting for whatever was chasing them to catch up. "Let's go," Emily said, pulling Sarah toward the basement door. The basement was even darker than the stairwell, the faint hum of fluorescent lights providing little comfort. The air was damp and cold, carrying the unmistakable stench of decay. As they descended the stairs, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, only to find the screen glitching, the once familiar display now a mess of static and distorted images. "Great," she muttered, shoving the phone back into her pocket. They reached the bottom of the stairs and found themselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with storage rooms. The scraping sound was louder now, reverberating through the walls like nails on a chalkboard. "This way," Sarah said, pointing to a door marked Maintenance. They pushed the door open and stepped inside, their flashlights illuminating rows of tools, shelves of cleaning supplies, and a large metal door labeled Emergency Exit. "Thank God," Sarah said, rushing toward the door. But as she reached for the handle, the scraping sound stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing down on them like a physical weight. Emily turned her flashlight toward the doorway they had just entered and froze. The shadowy figure stood there, its glowing eyes fixed on them. "Move!" Emily screamed, grabbing Sarah and yanking her toward the emergency exit. They threw open the door and stumbled outside into the freezing night air. Snow covered the ground, the icy wind cutting through their thin pajamas, but they didn't stop running. They sprinted across the campus, the shadowy figure still following, its glowing eyes a beacon in the darkness. Finally, they reached the main road, where a lone campus security car was parked. The officer inside looked up in surprise as the two girls banged on the window, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. "What's going on?" the officer asked, stepping out of the car. "It's in there," Emily shouted, pointing toward Carlton Hall. The officer shone his flashlight toward the building, but the shadowy figure was gone. "Stay here," he said, reaching for his radio. As the officer approached Carlton Hall, Emily and Sarah clung to each other, their bodies trembling from the cold and the terror of what they had just experienced. And then, just as the officer reached the entrance, the lights in the entire building flickered and went out. "Emily," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible, "I think it's not just the dorm that's haunted. I think it's the whole campus." The sudden darkness enveloped Carlton Hall, swallowing its silhouette into the night. Emily and Sarah stood frozen by the campus security car, their breaths fogging in the icy air. The officer had just entered the building, his flashlight now a lone, trembling beam in the abyss. "This isn't over, is it?" Sarah whispered, her voice carrying an edge of panic. Emily shook her head, clutching Sarah's arm tighter. It's just beginning." They waited for what felt like an eternity, their eyes locked on the dorm's entrance. The scraping sound returned, louder now, spilling out of the building and echoing across the quiet campus. But this time, it wasn't alone. A low, guttural growl joined the noise, followed by the faintest trace of a child's laughter, high-pitched and broken. The radio on the security car's dashboard crackled to life, pulling the girls' attention away from the dorm. "This is Officer Mitchell. I'm inside Carlton Hall," came the officer's voice, distorted and interspersed with static. "There's no sign of anyone in here, but something doesn't feel right." Emily's stomach clenched. "He needs to get out of there," she muttered, taking a step toward the car. Before she could reach for the radio, a blood-curdling scream erupted from the dorm, loud enough to pierce the quiet night. The officer's flashlight beam swung wildly, illuminating brief flashes of movement, twisted shadows darting across the windows and walls, and then the light disappeared. "We have to go!" Sarah shrieked, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her toward the main campus. They sprinted across the snow-covered lawn, their shoes crunching against the frost. Behind them, Carlton Hall loomed like a sleeping beast, its windows dark and lifeless. But the girls' terror only grew as they reached the central courtyard of the campus. The entire area was bathed in an eerie, unnatural glow. Lights flickered sporadically, and the massive clock tower that stood at the heart of the university began to chime, its haunting melody echoing in a slow, distorted rhythm that didn't match the time. "Why is it chiming at midnight?" Sarah gasped. "It's not even 10 yet." Emily didn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to the shadows gathering around the courtyard, shapes moving in the periphery of her vision. They weren't alone anymore. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing toward the library across the courtyard. A figure stood in the entrance, its head cocked at an unnatural angle. Its glowing eyes pierced the darkness, identical to the ones they had seen in Carlton Hall. "We're not safe here," Emily said, pulling Sarah away. "We need to find help." "But where?" Sarah whimpered, her voice shaking. Emily scanned the campus, her mind racing. The administration building wasn't far, and it might still have staff inside. "The admin building," she said. "Come on." They took off again, dodging between snow-covered benches and statues as the glowing-eyed figure began to move toward them. More shapes emerged from the shadows, half-seen forms that flickered in and out of existence like mirages. Their laughter echoed in the girls' ears, growing louder with every step. As they reached the administration building, Emily yanked on the heavy double doors, praying they were unlocked. To her relief, they opened easily, and she and Sarah slipped inside, slamming the doors shut behind them. The warmth of the building was a brief comfort, but it did little to quell the girls' panic. They were surrounded by rows of darkened offices, the fluorescent lights above buzzing faintly. The silence here felt even more oppressive than the outdoors. "Hello," Emily called out, her voice echoing through the empty halls. "Is anyone here?" No answer. "This is insane," Sarah said, clutching her arms. "How is this happening? Why is it happening?" Emily didn't respond. Her mind was focused on survival. "We need to call someone. Campus security isn't enough. We need police." Sarah nodded, following Emily deeper into the building. They reached the reception desk, where a single landline phone sat. Emily picked it up and dialed 911. her hands trembling. Nothing. No dial tone, no connection, just static. Of course, Emily muttered, slamming the receiver down. The phones are dead. Sarah let out a choked sob, sinking into one of the nearby chairs. We're going to die here, aren't we? Don't say that, Emily snapped, pacing back and forth. There has to be a way out of this. Suddenly, the lights above them flickered and went out, plunging the building into darkness. The only illumination came from the moonlight streaming through the large windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. Emily, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Look. Emily turned to see what Sarah was pointing at. In the reflection of the glass window, a figure stood behind them. A tall, gaunt shape with glowing eyes and a face that seemed to shift and twist like smoke. Before either of them could react, the building's fire alarm blared to life, the shrill sound piercing their ears. The red emergency lights flickered on, casting the hallways in a hellish glow. The figure in the window was gone, but the sound of footsteps echoed all around them. They're inside, Emily said, her voice barely audible over the alarm. We need to move. They ran deeper into the building, the footsteps following close behind. Every turn led them into another maze of darkened corridors, the red light making it impossible to tell which way was which. Finally, they burst into a large conference room. Emily slammed the door shut and locked it, leaning against it as she tried to catch her breath. This can't be real, Sarah said, pacing back and forth. This can't be happening. Emily was about to respond when the scraping sound returned, louder than ever. It was right outside the door. Whatever happened, Emily whispered, gripping Sarah's hand, we stick together. The door handle began to rattle, and the lights in the room flickered. The scraping turned into pounding, each thud shaking the door in its frame. And then the door burst open. The door flew open, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Emily and Sarah screamed as a rush of icy air swept into the conference room, extinguishing what little warmth remained. The shadowy figure filled the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on them, pulsing like faint embers. Behind it, others began to appear, their humanoid forms twisted and unnatural, their bodies flickering like static on a broken TV screen. Emily grabbed Sarah's arm and pulled her toward the opposite side of the room, where another door led into an adjoining office. They sprinted through it, slamming the door shut behind them. Emily locked it, her hands shaking so violently she nearly dropped the key. They won't stop, Sarah whispered, her back pressed against the wall. Her eyes were wide with fear, and tears streaked her face. They'll never stop. They will, Emily said, her voice shaking but resolute. They have to. There's a reason for all of this. We just have to figure it out. As if in response to her words, a deafening screech filled the air. The lights above flickered violently, and the walls of the office seemed to tremble. The screech wasn't just a sound. It was a pressure, a force that drilled into their skulls and made their vision blur. Emily stumbled toward the desk in the center of the room, clutching her head. Papers and office supplies were strewn across its surface, but something caught her eye. An old leather-bound ledger. She grabbed it, flipping through the brittle pages. What are you doing? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the unearthly noise. There's something here, Emily said, her eyes scanning the pages. Something about Carlton Hall. The ledger was filled with handwritten notes, most of them mundane records of the building's maintenance and occupancy. But near the back, the tone shifted. The writing became erratic, scrawled in jagged lines that seemed almost desperate. The spirits are restless. The renovations disturb them. They demand retribution. We thought we could contain them, but they are too strong. They feed on fear, on guilt, on pain. There is no escape. Emily's blood ran cold as she read the final entry. An offering must be made. Only then will they rest. An offering? Sarah said, peering over Emily's shoulder. What does that mean? I don't know, Emily said, slamming the book shut. But we need to get out of here, now. Before Sarah could respond, the door behind them exploded inward, shards of wood flying in every direction. The shadowy figures poured into the room, their glowing eyes locking onto the girls. Their movements were erratic, like puppets controlled by an invisible hand, and their whispers filled the air. a chaotic jumble of voices speaking in a language neither girl could understand. "Run!" Emily shouted, pulling Sarah toward the window. She grabbed a chair and hurled it through the glass, the pane shattering with a deafening crash. The icy wind rushed in, and Emily climbed onto the windowsill, helping Sarah through. They landed in the snow outside, the cold biting into their skin. The shadowy figures didn't hesitate. They began pouring out of the shattered window, their movements even more frantic, as if the girl's escape had enraged them. Emily and Sarah ran, their legs burning with exhaustion. The campus around them was a nightmare, the buildings distorted and shifting in the flickering red light. The clock tower loomed ahead, its warped chimes echoing through the night. "What do we do?" Sarah cried. "They're not stopping." Emily thought of the ledger's final words. An offering must be made. Her mind raced. What kind of offering? Was it a physical object? A sacrifice? She didn't have time to figure it out. All she knew was that they couldn't keep running forever. As they reached the base of the clock tower, Emily spotted a metal door partially ajar. She pulled it open, dragging Sarah inside. The interior was dark and cavernous, the only light coming from the faint glow of the figures outside, their shadows pressing against the frosted windows. Inside, the air felt heavy, oppressive. The sound of the clock's mechanism echoed above them, a rhythmic ticking that seemed to match the frantic beating of Emily's heart. "This place feels wrong," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It's all wrong, Esther," Emily said, "but it's our only chance." She turned and noticed a set of stairs spiraling upward. "Come on," she said, grabbing Sarah's hand. "We need to get higher." They climbed the stairs, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow space. The figures outside continued to gather, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. At the top of the tower, they found themselves in a small, circular room. The massive clock face loomed above them, its gears grinding and ticking. Emily scanned the room, her eyes landing on a small metal pedestal in the center. It was covered in strange, runic symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. "This has to be it," she said, approaching the pedestal. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, her voice filled with panic. "I don't know," Emily admitted, "but we have to try something." She placed her hands on the pedestal, and a surge of energy coursed through her body. The symbols began to glow brighter, and the room filled with a low, resonant hum. Outside, the shadowy figures stopped moving. They stood still, their glowing eyes fixed on the tower. "What's happening?" Sarah asked, stepping back. Emily didn't answer. She could feel something pulling at her, a presence pressing against her mind. It was cold and ancient, filled with a hunger that made her stomach churn. "You disturbed us," a voice said, deep and guttural. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You owe a debt." "What do you want?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "An offering," the voice replied. "A life for a life. Only then will we rest." Emily's heart sank. She turned to Sarah, who was staring at her with wide, terrified eyes. "No," Sarah said, shaking her head. "You can't." "I have to," Emily said, her voice breaking. "It's the only way." Before Sarah could stop her, Emily pressed down on the pedestal, the glowing runes searing into her palms. The room filled with a blinding light, and the figures outside let out a collective wail that shook the tower. Sarah screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening roar of the wind. And then everything went silent. When Sarah woke up, she was lying in the snow outside the clock tower. The campus was quiet, the night still. Carlton Hall stood in the distance, its windows dark and empty. Emily was gone. The police and university officials ruled the events as a tragic accident. Carlton Hall was closed indefinitely, its doors sealed and its windows boarded up. But Sarah knew the truth. Late at night, when the campus was quiet, she could still hear the whispers. Story number 4. The library at Crestwood University was a strange place. It had the charm of a bygone era, with its stained glass windows and intricate wood-carved beams, but it was oddly disconnected from the rest of the modern campus. The building stood apart, shrouded in old oak trees whose gnarled branches seemed to claw at its Gothic exterior. Students often joked about the library being cursed. Too many late-night urban legends whispered through the halls over the years. Claire hadn't paid much attention to the stories. A third-year English major with an overloaded schedule, she was too practical for such nonsense. The library was where she went to escape her noisy dorm and crank out essays with little distraction. She liked the solitude, the heavy silence of the place, and the way the dust motes floated lazily in the shafts of light cutting through the windows. But that night, the atmosphere felt different. It was nearly midnight, and Claire was huddled in her usual spot in the reading room, a corner table near the towering arched window. Her laptop's glow was the only source of light, casting eerie shadows on the worn-out table. Most students had left hours ago, and the silence had deepened into something oppressive. As she stared at her screen, struggling to piece together an essay on 19th century Gothic literature, she became aware of a faint sound. At first, she thought it was just the building settling. An old place like this was bound to creak and groan. But the sound persisted, low and mournful, like someone sobbing in the distance. Claire paused, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. She listened carefully. The crying was faint, barely audible, but unmistakably human. She glanced around the room. The rows of wooden desks were empty, and the grand staircase leading to the upper floors was bathed in shadow. The library staff had gone home hours ago, locking up everything but the main reading room for the late-night stragglers. Her pulse quickened. "Hello?" she called softly, her voice trembling. The crying stopped abruptly, plunging the library into an unnerving silence. Claire felt her skin prickle, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She shook her head, trying to convince herself that she was just tired, her mind playing tricks on her. Determined to finish her work, she turned back to her laptop, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes scanning the darkened corners of the library. Nothing, just rows of silent bookshelves and the faint hum of the ancient radiator. The clock on the wall ticked closer to midnight, each second seeming louder than the last. Then the crying started again, louder this time. Claire's chest tightened. The sound was no longer distant. It was close, too close, as if someone was standing just beyond the circle of light from her laptop. Her eyes darted to the shadows, but the dim light revealed nothing. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. No answer. Summoning her courage, Claire stood and grabbed her phone. She turned on the flashlight and aimed it toward the stacks. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rows of books and the polished wooden floor. "Hello," she called again, stepping cautiously toward the sound. The crying stopped once more, replaced by a chilling silence. Claire's heartbeat thundered in her ears as she crept deeper into the library. The shadows seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of her vision, but when she turned to look, everything was still. She reached the far corner of the reading room, where the history section began. The air felt colder here, and the faint scent of mildew hung in the air. She swept her flashlight over the shelves, half expecting to see someone crouched behind a stack of books. But the aisle was empty. Just as she was about to turn back, her light caught something unusual. On the wooden floor near the base of a shelf, there was a faint red smear. Claire knelt down, her stomach churning as she realized it looked like dried blood. Her mind raced. Maybe someone had gotten hurt, a cut finger, a nosebleed, but who would have left without cleaning it up? As she stood, she felt a sudden chill, as if an icy hand had brushed against her neck. She whipped around, her flashlight beam darting through the dark, but there was no one there. Then she heard it again, the crying. But this time, it was coming from behind her. She spun around, her light landing on a wooden door she hadn't noticed before. It was old, its surface scarred and weathered, and it stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The crying was louder now, more anguished. Every instinct screamed at her to leave, to run back to her table, grab her things, and get the hell out of the library. But her curiosity, or perhaps her stubbornness, drove her forward. She reached for the door, her hand trembling as she pushed it open. The crying stopped. Beyond the door was a small, dimly lit room. The single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered erratically, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The shelves here were different, older, their wood cracked and warped. They were lined with dusty books that looked untouched for decades. In the center of the room was a single wooden chair, and on the floor beneath it, the faint outline of a dark stain. Claire stepped inside, her every nerve on edge. "Is someone here?" she whispered. The door slammed shut behind her. She screamed and spun around, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room grew colder, and the light overhead flickered faster, plunging her into near darkness. Then she felt it, a presence, heavy and oppressive, filling the room. A soft voice whispered in her ear, chilling her to the bone. "You shouldn't have come here." Claire turned, her flashlight beam landing on the chair. It was empty, but the shadows in the room began to shift, coalescing into a figure. A woman, her form faint and flickering like a reflection on rippling water. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow and glowing faintly. Her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile as she stepped closer. "You're mine now," the woman said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Claire backed away, her heart pounding as the room seemed to close in around her. The woman's figure grew darker, her glowing eyes the only source of light as everything else faded to black. Claire screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the oppressive silence. And then, the crying began again. The darkness was suffocating. Claire's breaths came in short, shallow gasps as her trembling hands fumbled to find her phone. Her flashlight had gone out when the ghostly figure appeared, leaving her blind in the pitch-black room. The only sound was the faint crying that now surrounded her, echoing as if it were coming from the walls themselves. Her fingers finally brushed against the smooth surface of her phone. She pressed the power button, praying it would still work. The screen lit up, but the glow barely penetrated the oppressive blackness. Claire aimed the flashlight toward where the spectral woman had stood, but the corner was empty. The crying stopped. The silence was even worse. Claire's pulse thundered in her ears as she backed up against the door. She twisted the knob again, but it refused to budge. It felt as if someone, was holding it shut from the other side. "Let me out," she whispered, her voice quivering. "Please, let me out." A soft laugh echoed through the room. It was faint but unmistakable, a chilling sound that sent shivers down her spine. The laugh was followed by a whisper, so faint that Claire could barely make out the words. "You shouldn't have come here." "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. Her voice cracked, betraying her terror. The whisper grew louder, the words overlapping and blending into an incomprehensible cacophony. It felt as though a dozen voices were speaking at once, surrounding her, filling her head with their unnerving chorus. Claire covered her ears, but the whispers only grew louder, drilling into her skull. She sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Stop!" she screamed. "Please stop!" The whispers stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie stillness in their wake. Claire hesitated, her hands slowly lowering from her ears. For a brief moment, she thought she might be alone again. Then the shadows moved. From the corner of the room, the spectral figure of the librarian emerged once more. This time, her form was more solid, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hollow eyes fixed on Claire, and her lips curled into a grotesque smile. "You should have stayed in the light," the ghost said, her voice a low, guttural growl. Claire scrambled backward, her back pressing against the unyielding door. She raised her phone, the flashlight's beam trembling as it illuminated the ghost's face. The librarian's features were grotesque now, her skin gray and cracked, her hollow eyes glowing faintly. What do you want?" Claire stammered, her voice barely audible. The librarian tilted her head, her smile widening unnaturally. "I want you to listen," she said. Before Claire could react, the room around her shifted. The walls seemed to dissolve, replaced by a swirling void of darkness. She felt as if she were falling, her body weightless and suspended in an endless abyss. When the world solidified again, Claire was no longer in the small room. She found herself standing in the main library, but it was different. Darker, colder, and somehow wrong. The shelves stretched impossibly high, disappearing into the shadows above. The air was heavy with the scent of old paper and decay. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "This is where they come," the librarian's voice said, though the ghost was nowhere to be seen. "The ones who never leave." Claire turned in circles, her flashlight darting across the endless rows of shelves. She could feel eyes on her, unseen figures watching from the shadows. Her chest tightened, panic threatening to overwhelm her. "Who are you talking about?" she called out, her voice shaking. As if in response, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. This time, Claire could make out fragmented words and phrases. "Help me! Get out! It's too late! Stop it!" she screamed, her voice echoing through the vast, empty space. The whispers fell silent again, replaced by the sound of footsteps. Claire spun around, her flashlight beam sweeping across the shelves. The footsteps grew louder, coming closer, but no one was there. And then she saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows at the end of the aisle. It wasn't the librarian. It was something else. Its body was tall and emaciated, its skin stretched tightly over its bones. Its face was featureless, save for two glowing eyes that burned like embers in the darkness. Claire froze, her blood turning to ice. The figure stood motionless for a moment, its glowing eyes locked on hers. Then it took a step forward. "No," Claire whispered, backing away. "No, no, no." The figure began to move faster, its bony limbs moving unnaturally as it closed the distance between them. Claire turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she weaved through the endless rows of shelves. The sound of the figure's footsteps echoed behind her, growing louder with each passing second. She didn't dare look back, her mind consumed by the primal instinct to escape. She rounded a corner and saw a faint light in the distance, a flickering glow that seemed to beckon her. Claire sprinted toward it, her lungs burning and her legs screaming in protest. As she reached the light, she realized it was coming from another door. She threw herself against it, desperate to escape the pursuing figure. The door creaked open, and she stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind her. The room she entered was small and brightly lit, a stark contrast to the dark labyrinth she had just escaped. It was empty, save for a single desk and a dusty typewriter. Claire leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The sound of footsteps had stopped, but she could still feel the presence of the figure outside. The typewriter suddenly clicked, startling her. She stared at it, her heart pounding as the keys began to move on their own, typing out a single sentence. "You can't leave." Claire stared at the typewriter, her chest heaving as the reality of the situation settled over her. The words on the page mocked her. "You can't leave." "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'll find a way out. I have to." The room was suffocatingly silent, the hum of the flickering light bulb the only sound. Claire moved toward the desk cautiously, her legs trembling. As she reached for the paper, the typewriter suddenly jerked, typing furiously. Letter after letter appeared in rapid succession, the sound of the keys echoing like gunfire. Claire took a step back, heart pounding as the typewriter spat out another sentence. "You belong to her now." Her knees nearly buckled. Before she could process the ominous message, the light above her flickered violently and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Claire's phone flashlight still worked, but the beam felt small and powerless against the looming shadows that seemed to press in closer. She turned the light back toward the door. The whispers began again. This time they were louder and clearer. Voices overlapped, speaking her name over and over in a sickening chant. "Claire! Claire! Claire!" Her breathing hitched. The sound felt like it was burrowing into her skull, scratching at her sanity. The door rattled behind her as if something was slamming against it, trying to get in. "I don't belong to anyone," she screamed, spinning in every direction, searching for an escape. The air shifted. Cold tendrils of something unseen wrapped around her ankles, rooting her to the floor. She cried out, trying to pull herself free, but the invisible force only tightened its grip. A soft, chilling laugh filled the room. It wasn't the whispery chorus of voices this time. It was hers, the librarian. The walls of the room began to crack and splinter, pieces of reality falling away to reveal the void Claire had seen earlier. The desk and typewriter dissolved into the nothingness, leaving her standing on an island of floor surrounded by endless black. The librarian emerged from the darkness, her hollow eyes glowing faintly as she glided closer. Her figure was even more grotesque now, her tattered cardigan hanging from skeletal shoulders, her face a twisted mask of malice. "You shouldn't have stayed after hours," the ghost said, her voice a cruel mockery of politeness. "There are rules here. You broke them." Claire was trembling, her hands raised defensively in front of her. "I didn't know," she sobbed. "Please, I didn't know." The librarian tilted her head, her smile spreading unnaturally wide. "Ignorance doesn't absolve you, child. The library demands its patrons, and you will be the last." Claire shook her head furiously. "No, I'm not staying here. I'm not—" The librarian raised a bony hand, and Claire's words were cut off as an invisible force squeezed her throat. She clawed at her neck, gasping for air, but the librarian only watched, her expression unchanging. "You will join me," the ghost said, "and you will be silent, just like the others." As Claire's vision blurred, her flashlight fell from her grasp, clattering to the ground. The light flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving her in utter darkness. When Claire opened her eyes, she was back in the library. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the rows of shelves stretched out endlessly before her. But something was different. The air was heavier, the silence oppressive. She tried to move but found herself unable to. She was standing behind the checkout desk, her hands resting on the counter. A faint chill spread through her as she looked down at herself. Her reflection in the polished surface of the desk wasn't hers. Her skin was pale and cracked, her eyes hollow and glowing faintly in the dim light. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. "No!" she tried to scream, but the silence swallowed her words. The whispers returned, but now they were inside her head, an eternal chorus that would never cease. The library remained as it always had, quiet, unassuming, a refuge for students seeking solace in its hushed atmosphere. But if you stayed too late, you might notice the faint sound of crying or catch a glimpse of a pale, hollow-eyed figure behind the checkout desk. And if you were unlucky enough to meet her gaze, you'd learn the library's terrible secret. The patrons who stayed too long never truly left. Story number 5. Ethan gazed up at the looming Kappa Theta Epsilon fraternity house, its grandeur both inspiring and unsettling. The Victorian mansion stood like a monument to privilege, with its ivy-covered walls and intricately carved wooden doors. It was the kind of place that whispered secrets, the kind of place where legacies were forged. Ethan's palms were sweaty as he stood among the group of pledges on the cobblestone driveway. He had never thought he would end up here. A scholarship student from a small town, he was an outsider in every sense of the word. But Kappa Theta Epsilon had sought him out, inviting him to rush. It was the fraternity everyone on campus whispered about, the one that seemed to guarantee success. Kappa Theta brothers didn't just graduate, they dominated. They became CEOs, senators, judges, and power brokers. Ethan had been hesitant at first. Fraternities weren't his scene, and he'd heard the rumors, stories of hazing, of strange rituals, of pledges who had dropped out and vanished without a word. But the promise of connections and influence was too tempting to ignore. "Let's go, pledges!" A booming voice broke through his thoughts. Marcus, the fraternity president, stood at the top of the mansion's stone steps. His tailored suit and commanding presence made him look like he belonged on a magazine cover. His sharp blue eyes scanned the group, landing on Ethan for a moment before moving on. The pledges shuffled nervously as Marcus motioned for them to follow. They climbed the steps and entered the mansion, their footsteps echoing on the polished marble floor. The foyer was breathtaking. Vaulted ceilings, crystal chandeliers, and a grand staircase that spiraled upward. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and old money. "This house has stood for over a century," Marcus began, his voice authoritative. "Kappa Theta Epsilon is not just a fraternity. It's a legacy, a brotherhood built on loyalty, tradition, and sacrifice. Tonight, you will prove you are worthy of joining us." Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. There was something about the way Marcus said sacrifice that made him uneasy. The pledges were led deeper into the house, past ornate sitting rooms and hallways lined with portraits of past fraternity members. The faces in the paintings seemed to watch them as they walked, their eyes cold and piercing. Finally, they reached a door at the end of a hallway. Marcus pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit room. The smell of burning incense hit Ethan immediately, sharp and overpowering. The room's walls were covered in strange symbols, and in the center stood a large table draped with a crimson cloth. On the table was a single object, an ornate dagger with a jeweled hilt. Its blade caught the candlelight, glinting ominously. "This is the initiation," Marcus announced. "Tonight, you will prove your commitment to Kappa Theta Epsilon. You will prove your loyalty, your strength, and your willingness to do what must be done." Ethan's stomach churned as he exchanged nervous glances with the other pledges. What exactly were they being asked to do? The fraternity brothers formed a circle around the room, their faces expressionless. The air grew heavy with tension as Marcus continued. "One by one, you will step forward and perform the ritual. Do not hesitate. Do not question. Obey, and you will be rewarded." The first pledge, a wiry kid named Jake, was called forward. His hands shook as he approached the table. One of the brothers handed him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. When Jake unwrapped it, Ethan's breath caught in his throat. It was a rabbit, its tiny body trembling with fear. Jake looked up at Marcus, his face pale. I don't think I can do this." "You can," Marcus said, his tone firm. "And you will." Jake hesitated, his grip on the dagger unsteady. The room was silent except for the faint crackle of the candles. Finally, with a cry, Jake brought the blade down. Ethan felt sick as he watched the rabbit's lifeless body slump onto the table. The brothers began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic. Jake staggered back, his face ashen, but no one comforted him. One by one, the pledges were called forward. Each time, the same scene played out. The dagger, the rabbit, the blood. Ethan's turn came last. He approached the table, his legs feeling like lead. The rabbit in his hands felt warm and fragile, its heartbeat rapid against his fingers. The weight of the dagger was heavy, its blade sharp and cold. "Do it," Marcus commanded. Ethan's hand trembled as he raised the dagger. His mind screamed at him to stop, to run, to get out of this house and never look back. But the brothers' eyes were on him, their expressions expectant. He couldn't back out now. With a deep breath, Ethan brought the blade down. The room erupted in cheers as the brothers clapped him on the back, congratulating him. But Ethan didn't feel victorious. He felt hollow. The rest of the night passed in a blur. The pledges were sworn to secrecy, their loyalty sealed with a solemn oath. But as Ethan lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just crossed a line he couldn't uncross. What had he gotten himself into? Ethan spent the next few days in a haze of unease. The cheers, the oath, the hollow congratulations from the other brothers. All of it had felt staged, like a performance designed to mask something much darker. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, his dreams were filled with crimson-stained tables and the frantic heartbeat of the rabbit in his hands. Still, he tried to push through, convincing himself it was just nerves. After all, joining Kappa Theta Epsilon was supposed to be a privilege. It was the fraternity that opened doors, that turned ordinary students into future leaders. Ethan had sacrificed a lot to be here. A scholarship, hours of work study, his connection to the simplicity of home. And he wasn't going to let some strange ritual scare him off. But then, the whispers started. It began in the dining hall. Ethan was sitting with a few other pledges when he caught snippets of conversation from the table behind him. "Hey, did you hear about the kid who dropped out last year?" "Yeah, Jared something. Just disappeared after the initiation. Same thing happened a few years ago, a sophomore named Kyle. No one talks about it, though." Ethan's ears perked up, but when he turned to look, the group had fallen silent. Later that evening, as he was walking back to the fraternity house, he swore he heard footsteps behind him. He glanced over his shoulder, but the quad was empty, the streetlights casting long, eerie shadows on the cobblestones. When he finally reached the house, he found Marcus waiting for him in the common room. The fraternity president was sitting in a leather armchair, sipping from a crystal glass. His sharp blue eyes locked onto Ethan as soon as he entered. "Ethan," Marcus said, his tone as smooth as ever. "Come, sit." Ethan hesitated before taking a seat on the couch opposite Marcus. "How are you settling in?" Marcus asked. "Fine," Ethan lied. Marcus's lips curved into a faint smile. "Good, I'm glad to hear it. You showed real promise during the initiation. Not everyone has the fortitude to follow through." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "Yeah, about that. What exactly was the point of the ritual? I mean, it seemed kind of extreme." Marcus leaned back in his chair, swirling the liquid in his glass. "It's about commitment, sacrifice. You see, Kappa Theta Epsilon isn't just a fraternity. It's a brotherhood bound by a higher purpose. We don't just strive for success, we ensure it." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Have you ever wondered why our brothers always excel? Why we dominate in every field we enter? It's because we have an edge, Ethan." A pact. Ethan's stomach tightened. "A pact with who?" "Not who," Marcus corrected. "What?" Before Ethan could respond, Marcus stood and motioned for him to follow. Reluctantly, Ethan trailed him through the mansion, down a hallway he hadn't noticed before. At the end was a heavy wooden door. Marcus unlocked it with a key from his pocket and pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The air grew colder as they descended, the stone walls damp and unwelcoming. At the bottom was another door, this one reinforced with iron. Marcus opened it to reveal a cavernous room lit by flickering torches. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The room was filled with artifacts, ancient scrolls, carvings, and statues depicting grotesque, otherworldly beings. In the center of the room stood an altar, its surface stained dark with something Ethan didn't want to think about. "This," Marcus said, gesturing to the altar, "is the source of our power. Decades ago, the founders of Kappa Theta Epsilon made a pact with an entity. In exchange for loyalty and sacrifice, it grants us wealth, success, and influence." Ethan's mouth went dry. "Sacrifice?" Marcus smiled. "Yes. Every year we offer something in return. It's a small price to pay for what we gain. And before you ask, no, it's not random. The offering is always chosen carefully." Ethan took a step back, his mind racing. "This is insane. You're telling me the fraternity's success is because of some demon?" "Call it what you will," Marcus said, his tone indifferent. "But the results speak for themselves. Look at our alumni. Look at our influence. This is what you've joined, Ethan. A legacy, a brotherhood that transcends the ordinary." Ethan felt a wave of nausea. "And if I don't want to be a part of this?" Marcus's expression darkened. "Then you leave us no choice. Once you're in, there's no going back. You're either with us or you're against us. And trust me, Ethan, you don't want to be against us." The threat hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Ethan's mind screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. "You should go get some rest," Marcus said, his tone lightening as if the conversation had never happened. "We'll talk more soon." Ethan nodded numbly and made his way back up the stairs. The house felt different now, darker, more sinister. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed him. He had to find a way out. Ethan lay awake, his mind racing through the revelations of the night. His room, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The walls seemed to close in on him, the fraternity house no longer just a grand building, but a tomb that held him hostage. Every shadow danced with menace, and every creak of the old wood floors echoed with foreboding. He knew Marcus had meant what he said. There was no escape from Kappa Theta Epsilon. The next morning, Ethan resolved to uncover the truth. He couldn't simply walk away, not without understanding what he was dealing with. If there was any chance of freeing himself, he needed to know the full extent of the fraternity's dark secret. Ethan began his search in the library where the fraternity kept its history. The section labeled Traditions of Kappa Theta Epsilon was filled with leather-bound books, their spines worn and titles faded. He pulled one from the shelf, coughing as a cloud of dust erupted. The pages were brittle, the text written in a formal, archaic style. As he flipped through, he found references to the fraternity's founding in the late 1800s. It was established by 6 men, all of whom went on to achieve great wealth and power. But what stood out to Ethan was a passage describing their unwavering dedication to the greater good of the brotherhood, cemented by a sacred pact. The wording was vague, but the implications were clear. His heart pounded as he read on, uncovering cryptic mentions of an annual tradition and offerings to the benefactor. The book offered no explicit details, but Ethan didn't need them. The truth was hiding in plain sight. When he returned to his room, he found a note slipped under his door. The handwriting was elegant, but the words sent a chill down his spine. The next meeting is tonight, midnight. Attendance is mandatory. Ethan crumpled the note in his hand, his pulse quickening. He had no choice but to go. As the clock struck midnight, Ethan joined the other brothers in the main hall. The atmosphere was different, darker, heavier. Marcus stood at the head of the room, his commanding presence silencing any murmurs. "Brothers," he began, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to press down on everyone. "Tonight, we honor the pact that has brought us success and fortune for generations. Tonight, we fulfill our duty." The group moved as one, following Marcus through the house and down the same hidden staircase Ethan had descended the night before. This time, the room at the bottom was filled with torches, their flames casting eerie shadows on the walls. The altar in the center was draped with a crimson cloth, and a chalice sat atop it, its surface gleaming in the firelight. Ethan's stomach churned as Marcus began to speak again. "The offering has been chosen," Marcus announced. "One among us will fulfill their role, ensuring the continued prosperity of Kappa Theta Epsilon." Ethan's breath caught. One among us. He scanned the faces of the other brothers, each one as pale and anxious as his own. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "The name has been selected. Step forward when you are called." The room fell silent as Marcus unfolded the paper. He looked up, his piercing blue eyes locking onto Ethan. "Ethan!" The world seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. His knees felt weak, his heart pounding so hard it hurt. "No," he whispered. Marcus's expression remained unreadable. "It is an honor, Ethan. Your sacrifice will ensure the success of every brother here, now and in the future." Ethan took a step back, shaking his head. "This isn't happening. You're insane." 2 brothers moved to block his escape, their faces grim. Marcus stepped closer, his tone softening. "It's not insanity, Ethan. It's tradition. It's destiny. Every pledge knows the risk when they join, whether they admit it to themselves or not. You are the chosen one." Ethan's mind raced. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't just accept it. "Why me?" he demanded, his voice shaking. "Because the benefactor always chooses," Marcus replied, "and it chose you." Ethan's fight or flight instincts kicked in. He lunged for the door, shoving past the 2 brothers. Chaos erupted as others tried to grab him, but adrenaline gave him the strength to break free. He sprinted up the stairs, his footsteps echoing in the narrow passageway. He burst into the main hall, frantically looking for an exit, but the house was a labyrinth, and the shadows seemed to shift, confusing his sense of direction. He could hear the others behind him, their shouts growing louder. Ethan darted into a room and slammed the door shut, his chest heaving. He searched for something to barricade the door, but the room was empty except for a single chair. He wedged it under the doorknob, praying it would hold. Then he noticed something strange. The room wasn't empty after all. On the far wall was a mirror, its surface rippling as if it were water. Ethan approached cautiously, his reflection staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. The mirror shimmered, and suddenly, the reflection wasn't his own. It was a figure, a grotesque, otherworldly being with burning red eyes and a twisted, toothy grin. Ethan stumbled back, his heart racing. The figure in the mirror tilted its head as if amused. "You cannot run," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "You are mine." The door burst open, and the brothers flooded in. Marcus stepped forward, his expression calm but unyielding. "Ethan," he said, "it's over." Ethan shook his head, his back against the wall. "I won't do it. I won't be your sacrifice. Marcus sighed, almost pityingly. You don't have a choice. The brothers advanced, grabbing Ethan and dragging him back down to the basement. He fought with everything he had, but there were too many of them. As they reached the altar, Ethan was forced onto his knees. Marcus raised the chalice, chanting in a language Ethan didn't understand. The torches flickered wildly, and the room seemed to hum with dark energy. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing himself for the end. But then, something unexpected happened. The mirror in the corner of the room shattered, and the air was filled with an ear-splitting roar. The entity had arrived. The roar that echoed through the room froze everyone in place. The temperature plummeted, and an unnatural wind extinguished the torches, plunging the basement into near darkness. In the flickering light of the single remaining flame, the demonic figure from the mirror materialized in the room. Its form was grotesque. Blackened skin stretched taut over skeletal limbs, glowing crimson eyes that seemed to pierce the soul, and horns that curved ominously. It towered over the brothers, radiating malice and power. "Who dares summon me?" the entity growled, its voice resonating with an otherworldly depth. Marcus, regaining his composure, stepped forward and bowed deeply. "Great benefactor, we honor you with this year's offering." The demon turned its gaze to Ethan, who was pinned to the ground by two brothers. Its lips twisted into a horrifying grin. "This one?" it hissed, stepping closer. Ethan trembled, his heart racing as the demon loomed over him. But then, to everyone's surprise, the creature paused, tilting its head as though studying him. "This one is different," the demon said, its voice tinged with intrigue. Marcus frowned. "He is our chosen sacrifice, as per tradition. He will fulfill the pact." The demon laughed, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the room. "Tradition?" it mocked. "Your little rituals amuse me, but they are not binding. The pact does not require your choice, it requires mine." The brothers exchanged nervous glances, their confidence beginning to waver. Marcus, however, stood firm. "We have upheld our end of the bargain for generations. Our success depends on this ritual." The demon snarled, its eyes blazing. "Your success depends on me, mortal, and I decide how the pact is fulfilled." It turned back to Ethan, who met its gaze with a mix of fear and defiance. "You have spirit," the demon said, "a rare trait among these cowards." It gestured dismissively at the other brothers. Ethan swallowed hard. "If you don't need me as a sacrifice, then let me go," he said, his voice shaking but resolute. The demon grinned wider, revealing rows of jagged teeth. "Let you go? Oh no, you intrigue me, mortal. I offer you a choice." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. "A choice?" Ethan echoed. The demon nodded. "Yes, you can take their place," it said, gesturing to the brothers. "Join me as my servant, wielding power beyond your wildest dreams. Or," it paused, savoring the moment, "you can walk away free and unscathed. But if you do, the pact will still demand blood, and it will not discriminate. It will take your family, your friends, anyone you care about." Ethan's blood ran cold. The weight of the choice pressed down on him, suffocating. He glanced at the brothers, who now looked genuinely afraid. Marcus stepped forward, desperation in his eyes. "Ethan, don't listen to it. Fulfill your duty, and this will all be over." Ethan turned to the demon. "If I become your servant, what happens to them?" he asked, gesturing to the brothers. The demon chuckled darkly. "They will be spared, for now, but their time will come. My servants are eternal, Ethan. You will outlast them all." Ethan's mind raced. He didn't want to sacrifice himself, but he couldn't condemn innocent people to death. Yet becoming a servant to this creature seemed like a fate worse than death. Finally, he made his decision. "I'll do it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll be your servant." The brothers gasped, and Marcus stepped forward. "No, you can't." The demon silenced him with a wave of its hand, sending Marcus flying across the room. It turned back to Ethan, its grin widening. "Wise choice," it said. The demon extended a clawed hand, and Ethan hesitated for only a moment before taking it. The room was engulfed in blinding light, and Ethan felt a surge of power course through him. It was both excruciating and euphoric. as though his very soul was being reshaped. When the light faded, Ethan stood tall, his eyes glowing crimson like the demon's. His humanity was gone, replaced by something darker, something eternal. The demon laughed triumphantly. Welcome, my new servant. Your life as you knew it is over, but your existence has just begun. The brothers cowered, their once proud fraternity now reduced to a group of terrified men. The demon turned to them one last time. Your pact is fulfilled, it said, but remember, there is always a price. With that, the demon and Ethan vanished, leaving the brothers to grapple with the horror of what they had witnessed. Months later, whispers of a new urban legend spread across campus. Students spoke of a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes seen lurking near the fraternity house. Some said it was a warning, others believed it was a curse. For Ethan, it was neither. It was simply his new reality. Bound to the demon, he roamed the campus, forever tied to the fraternity's dark secret. He had gained power beyond his imagination, but at a cost he could never undo. In the end, the fraternity's dark secret didn't just claim another victim, it created a new nightmare. And Ethan, once desperate to escape, had become the very thing he feared. The price of brotherhood was eternal, and Ethan would pay it forever. Story number 6. The legend of Professor Edward Holloway had been passed down through the generations at Archmere University, a prestigious institution known for its history and academic excellence. But there was a darker side to its reputation, a side whispered about in hushed tones among students who dared to speak of it at all. Every year, as the anniversary of his death approached, the legend resurfaced, each retelling bringing with it a fresh layer of terror. And so, as the leaves began to fall and the chill of autumn swept across campus, the stories of Professor Holloway resurfaced once again. Professor Holloway was not a man of grand stature, but his presence was undeniable. In the late 1970s, he was a well-respected professor in the Department of English Literature, renowned for his sharp mind and uncompromising standards. Students flocked to his courses, eager to hear his lectures on the intricacies of Shakespeare and the depths of Victorian literature. He was the type of professor that made you feel both challenged and awestruck, his dry wit paired with an unrelenting pursuit of academic perfection. His colleagues praised his intellect, and his students admired his commitment to education. But there was something about Holloway that kept people at arm's length. His colleagues would speak of his dark moods, his penchant for isolation. His office, tucked away on the third floor of the English building, was rumored to be littered with stacks of unfinished papers, books half read, and yellowing journal articles from years gone by. Despite his brilliance, Holloway seemed to be perpetually trapped in a cycle of frustration. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the whispers about Holloway took on a darker tone. Students began to notice a subtle shift in his behavior. He became more reclusive, spending less time in the halls of academia and more time in the solitude of his office. His lectures, once so full of passion, became distant and mechanical, as if Holloway was merely going through the motions. There were rumors of a troubled marriage, a wife who had left him, and the constant weight of financial problems weighing down on him. His work, which had once been celebrated, began to lose its luster, overshadowed by the accusations of plagiarism that had begun to swirl around him. The details of the accusation were never entirely clear, but one thing was certain. Holloway's reputation, once sterling, was now irrevocably damaged. A well-known journal had claimed that Holloway had stolen a colleague's work, presenting it as his own in a lecture. The scandal shook the academic community to its core, and while Holloway vehemently denied the accusations, the damage was done. He was ostracized by his peers, his lectures were canceled, and students began to withdraw from his courses. But it wasn't just the professional fallout that sent Holloway into a spiral. His personal life seemed to collapse around him. Friends and family distanced themselves, unable to bear the weight of his depression. Holloway became a ghost of the man he once was, isolated, lonely, and desperate for redemption that never came. It was on a cold October evening that the end came. Holloway had been struggling for months, living in the shadow of his failed career and broken relationships. He had reached the breaking point, a place where the darkness consumed every part of him. On the morning of October 13th, a group of students arrived at the lecture hall for their 10 a.m. class, only to find the door locked. Inside, Holloway had shut himself away, his office door barricaded, and his phone left unanswered. It wasn't until the end of the day that a janitor noticed something strange, a faint flickering of light coming from the lecture hall. Hesitant, the janitor unlocked the door and entered, only to be greeted by the gruesome sight of Professor Holloway, lying lifeless at the front of the classroom. A gun rested in his hand, its barrel still warm from the fatal shot that had ended his life. The scene was shocking, brutal, and impossible to comprehend. Holloway's final words, written in a hastily scrawled note on the blackboard, read, "No one will save me." The news of Professor Holloway's suicide spread quickly across campus, and the campus was left reeling from the tragedy. Students and faculty alike struggled to make sense of what had happened. How could a man who had once been so revered, so brilliant, have fallen so far? How had he gone from an admired scholar to a broken, isolated figure? The day of his death marked the beginning of the legend, and from that moment on, Lecture Hall B, the very room where Holloway had taken his life, became something more than just a classroom. It became a place where the echoes of his despair lingered, a place where the living could hear the faint whispers of a tortured soul. At first, the signs were subtle. Some students reported feeling a sudden chill in the air during late-night study sessions. Others claimed to have heard faint whispers, low murmurs that sounded like voices from the past, echoing from the back of the room. These strange occurrences were dismissed as mere figments of imagination or the result of overworked minds. But as time passed, the incidents grew more frequent. It wasn't until the first anniversary of Professor Holloway's death that the true horror began. On that day, students who dared to enter the lecture hall after dark reported hearing faint sobs, soft and sorrowful, coming from the front of the room. Some claimed to have seen a shadowy figure standing behind the podium, its form flickering in and out of existence like a bad television signal. The figure, though never fully visible, seemed to be watching them, its presence oppressive, suffocating. The rumors began to spread. Some students spoke of strange occurrences in the hall, papers falling off desks, chalk moving across the blackboard by itself, and doors opening on their own. Others said they could hear Holloway's voice, calling out from the shadows. The whispers grew louder as each year passed, the anniversary of his death becoming an annual reminder of the tragedy and the lingering presence of the professor's spirit. By the time Lisa, Kyle, Julia, and Mark heard the story, the legend had become a part of Archmere University's culture. No one doubted the existence of the haunting anymore. It was a well-known fact, discussed in hushed tones between students and professors alike. Some spoke of the ghost of Professor Holloway with respect, others with fear, but all agreed that the lecture hall was best avoided on the anniversary of his death. Those who ventured inside had returned with stories of shadowy figures, unexplained noises, and an overwhelming sense of dread. Lisa had heard the stories before, of course, but had always dismissed them as exaggerated tall tales. She wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or spirits, but when the topic came up during a late-night study session with her friends, something shifted. The fear that had once seemed distant now felt palpable, and curiosity gnawed at her mind. She couldn't help but wonder, was it just a legend, or was there something more to the tale of Professor Holloway's tragic end? Lisa had always prided herself on being a skeptic. She was the type to roll her eyes at ghost stories, the kind of person who questioned everything, especially when it came to things that couldn't be proven. But as the legend of Professor Holloway's death resurfaced around campus, a strange curiosity took hold of her. Her friends, Kyle, Julia, and Mark, had always been eager to entertain the darker rumors of Archmere University, but this time was different. This time, they were all a little more intrigued. The chilly October evening had arrived, and with it, the 10th anniversary of Professor Holloway's death. It was a night like any other in Archmere, with students milling about, studying for midterms and preparing for the upcoming weekend. The campus was alive with the hum of everyday life, but there was an undercurrent of tension in the air. It wasn't the usual college anxiety over grades or relationships. It was something else, something primal that hung in the atmosphere like a heavy fog. The four friends found themselves gathered in the common room of their dormitory, the conversation naturally gravitating toward the anniversary of Holloway's death. The air was thick with the quiet whispers of ghost stories passed down from upperclassmen, but tonight, something about the room felt different. Lisa glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly midnight. "We should go," Mark said, his voice low but excited, the edge of a dare in his tone. Lisa raised an eyebrow, already knowing where this was headed. Mark was the kind of person who loved testing limits, especially when it came to proving that things weren't as spooky as people made them out to be. But there was something in his eyes tonight, something that made Lisa pause. He was serious, his usual bravado replaced by something far more contemplative. "You're not actually suggesting we go into the lecture hall, are you?" Lisa asked, trying to hide the slight tremor of uncertainty in her voice. Kyle, sitting next to Lisa, leaned forward, his eyes wide with excitement. "Why not? We've all heard the stories, seen the videos, but we've never actually been in there at midnight. Why not make our own conclusions?" Julia, who had been quietly listening, shook her head, but with a glint of nervous excitement in her eyes. "I don't know. I've heard things, you know. People have said they saw him there. Holloway's ghost, I mean. Maybe we should leave it alone." Mark scoffed. "We're all here to prove it's a myth, right? Let's put this silly thing to bed once and for all. No one's actually seen anything. It's just a bunch of stories." Lisa hesitated. Part of her wanted to dismiss it all as nonsense, but another part of her felt a strange pull, an urge to see for herself. The idea of confronting the unknown, of being in that room when the clock struck midnight, was intoxicating. Her skepticism wavered for the first time. She glanced at the others, their expressions ranging from eager to apprehensive, and she felt a rush of adrenaline. "Okay," she said, finally giving in. "We'll go, but we're sticking together, right?" "Of course," Mark said, already standing. "We'll be in and out. Just a quick look around, and we'll be back before anyone even knows we're gone." The four of them bundled up in their jackets, the October chill biting through the thin fabric. As they made their way across the quad, the campus seemed eerily quiet, the usual sounds of student chatter and footsteps absent. It was as if the university itself held its breath, waiting. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but she shook off the thought, focusing on her friends ahead of her. When they arrived at the English building, the old brick structure loomed dark and foreboding in front of them. The streetlights cast long shadows across the ground, creating an almost unnatural silence. The main door was locked as expected, but Mark led them around to the side entrance, the one that was usually left unlocked after hours. He fiddled with the door for a moment before it creaked open. "After you," he said, grinning. Lisa stepped inside first, her heart thudding in her chest. The air inside was colder than it had been outside, thick with dust and the scent of aging wood. The hallway seemed even darker than usual, the faint light from the street lamps casting long, twisted shadows across the walls. They made their way to the lecture hall on the third floor, and with each step, Lisa's unease grew. The lecture hall was the last room in the corridor, and as they reached the door, it seemed to resist their attempts to open it. The rusty hinges squealed in protest, but finally it gave way. A musty, ancient smell wafted out as the door swung open, and Lisa was hit by a sudden rush of cold air that made her shiver. They stepped into the room, and immediately Lisa felt a weight settle over her. It wasn't the usual creepiness of an old empty building. It was something more. There was an oppressive silence, a heaviness in the air that felt wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she swallowed hard, trying to push the creeping fear down. The lecture hall was just as they had imagined it. Rows of seats, an old wooden podium at the front, and dusty blackboards lining the walls. But something about the room felt off, as if it had been untouched for years. The shadows seemed to cling to every corner, thick and suffocating. There was a sense that the space was holding its breath, waiting for something. "So, where's the ghost?" Kyle joked, his voice too loud in the silence. Mark grinned, but his eyes were scanning the room. "Right here," he said, tapping the podium with his fingers. "This is where it all happened. Professor Holloway took his life right here." Lisa frowned. She had heard the stories, but hearing them spoken aloud made everything seem more real. The idea that someone had died in this very room, in such a tragic and violent way, was unsettling. As they stood there in the center of the room, Lisa felt a strange sensation crawling up her spine. It was as though something was watching them. Her eyes darted around the room, but everything was still. She told herself it was just the anxiety of the moment, but the feeling of being watched intensified. Mark was standing by the blackboard, idly running his fingers over the surface. "You guys ever wonder what Holloway's final moments were like?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Why would you even ask that?" Julia replied, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "I mean, it's bizarre, isn't it?" Mark said. "A man so broken that he took his own life, right in front of all these students. And now every year we come here to play ghost hunters. It's just weird." Lisa glanced at the door, then back at her friends. The room felt even colder now, the silence more oppressive. She opened her mouth to say something, but before she could, there was a loud bang. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot, making them all jump. Everyone froze and Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The door had slammed shut on its own. Mark rushed to the door, his hands fumbling at the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in his chest as he pulled harder, but the door remained locked. "This isn't funny anymore," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. Lisa felt the air in the room shift. Something was wrong. She could feel it in the pit of her stomach, a deep, primal fear that made her legs weak. The temperature had dropped, and she could see her breath misting in the air. The faint sobs, the ones that had been whispered about by students for years, were now audible. Lisa turned, but there was no one behind her, just the empty seats. The whispering grew louder, as if the room itself was crying out for something. Something or someone. Then a shadow moved. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of the room. But when Lisa looked again, it was standing there, at the podium. A figure, just barely visible in the low light, its outline distorted and strange. It looked like a person, but not quite. The edges of its form blurred, like a mirage. Its eyes gleamed with a sickly yellow hue, and Lisa's breath caught in her throat as the figure slowly turned toward her. "Run," Kyle whispered. But it was too late. The doors slammed shut behind them. The shadows in the room deepened. The figure stepped forward. The last thing Lisa heard before the darkness consumed her was the sound of a voice, low, hollow, and full of anguish. "Welcome to my classroom." The room seemed to close in around Lisa, as though the very walls of the lecture hall were shifting, bending to the will of whatever dark force had taken hold. Her chest tightened, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. She tried to move, but her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the floor by an invisible weight. The figure in the front of the room, Professor Holloway's ghost, or whatever it was, began to step toward them, its hollow eyes fixed on Lisa, a sadistic gleam reflecting in the dim light. What do you want?" Lisa stammered, her voice barely a whisper. She could barely force the words past the lump in her throat. She had never been religious, but at that moment she silently prayed, hoping that whatever this thing was, it would spare them. The ghost didn't answer immediately. Instead, it tilted its head in a slow, almost contemplative motion, as though savoring their fear. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of decay wafted through the room, making Lisa gag. She wanted to run, she wanted to scream, but her body wouldn't obey. It was as if the figure was feeding off her terror, growing stronger with each passing second. Mark was the first to break the silence. He rushed to the door again, pulling with all his strength, but the handle refused to move. Panic spread across his face as he looked at Lisa, his expression frantic. "It's not opening! We're trapped!" "We're not leaving," a voice croaked from the figure in the front. The words sent a shiver down Lisa's spine, cold and sharp like a dagger through her heart. The ghost had spoken, and with it came a sense of finality, a chilling truth. "No!" Julia cried, her voice cracking. "We have to get out of here!" But it was already too late. The figure raised its arm, and with it came a wave of icy air that hit them like a tidal wave. The room seemed to stretch out, distorting and warping, as though the very fabric of reality was being pulled apart. Lisa staggered back, her heart racing in her chest, her mind screaming for her to escape. But there was no escape. The door was locked, and the room seemed to twist in impossible ways. The figure spoke again, its voice softer now, but no less menacing. "You've disturbed me," it said, its words slow and deliberate. "For years, I've waited for someone to test the legend, for someone to challenge what is written in these walls. Now you will learn the lesson I've been forced to teach." With a sudden, sharp motion, the ghost reached out and touched the blackboard. The chalk moved of its own accord, writing on the dusty surface in jagged, erratic strokes. It spelled out a name, Holloway. But as the name formed, the letters began to shift, to morph into something darker, something far more sinister. "Do you understand?" the ghost asked, its voice now a hollow echo, reverberating in the corners of the room. Mark stepped forward, shaking with terror. "What do you mean? What do you want from us?" The figure smiled, a twisted, grotesque grin that made Lisa's blood run cold. "You will become a part of my lesson, the final exam, if you will." Before they could react, the lights flickered and the shadows in the room deepened, spreading across the floor like a rising tide. The chairs in the lecture hall creaked and groaned, as if something beneath them was shifting, ready to swallow them whole. A soft whisper, like a breath on the wind, circled Lisa's ears. She recognized the words. It was the same phrase she had heard earlier, the one that had filled her with dread. "It's too late to leave." And then, with a jolt, everything stopped. The room was still, eerily quiet. The figure at the front of the room was gone, leaving only the lingering presence of its darkness. The doors were wide open. The floor was normal again. The oppressive cold had vanished. For a moment, Lisa thought it had all been a nightmare, an elaborate prank maybe, or a figment of her imagination. But when she looked around, she saw the horror etched into her friends' faces. They were alive, yes, but they were not the same. There was a deep terror in their eyes now, an understanding that couldn't be unlearned. Julia was the first to speak, her voice trembling with disbelief. What just happened?" Lisa didn't have an answer. She didn't know how to explain it. She didn't know if she wanted to. All she knew was that they had crossed a line. They had summoned something that had never been meant to be disturbed. Mark, his face pale and drawn, stood frozen by the door, staring at the exit as if it were a mirage. "We have to leave," he said, his voice shaking. "We have to get out of here." They stumbled out of the lecture hall, their movements sluggish, as though their limbs were heavy with dread. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, and the sound echoed through the empty hallway as if the room itself had become a tomb. The darkness of the building seemed to cling to them, following them as they hurried down the corridor and out into the cool night air. Once outside, Lisa took a deep breath, as though trying to expel the suffocating fear from her lungs. Her heart was still pounding, and she could feel the weight of what they had just witnessed pressing down on her chest. The cold air was a relief, but it didn't erase the sense of horror that had taken root in her soul. What the hell was that?" Kyle muttered, his voice barely audible as he tried to catch his breath. "That wasn't a ghost. It was something else. Something worse." They stood there for a moment, staring at the darkened campus. The quiet was deafening now, the kind of silence that presses on you, the silence that is not peaceful but suffocating. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone, that something was watching them from the shadows. And then, in the distance, she heard it, faint at first but unmistakable, the sound of a chalkboard marker scraping against the board. It was the same noise they had heard before, the same unsettling screech that sent chills down their spines. Without a word, the group turned and ran, their footsteps echoing in the night. The next morning, the lecture hall was empty. The rumors would spread, as they always did, about what had happened. Some would say it was just another ghost story, another campus legend. Others would whisper that Lisa and her friends had been the victims of a terrible fate, but no one would dare to go back into that room again. And as for Lisa, she would never forget the lesson she learned that night. Some myths are rooted in truth, and some truths are better left buried. These stories prove that even the most ordinary places can hide extraordinary horrors. As you step onto your campus or visit a college, remember, Sometimes the whispers in the hallway aren't in your head, and the shadow watching you might not be your imagination. If you've ever experienced something terrifying on campus, let us know in the comments. We might just feature it in our next video. Until then, stay safe, stay vigilant, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that could happen to you.